Section 14 of Library of the World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nadine Eckert-Boulet. Library of the World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 3, by Julian Hawthorne, Editor. Section 14. A Mystery with a Moral, by Laurence Sterne. Introduction to A Mystery with a Moral. The next mystery story is like no other in these volumes. The editor's defense lies in the plea that Laurence Sterne is not like other writers of English. He is certainly one of the very greatest, yet nowadays he is generally unknown. His rollicking frankness, his audacious unconventionality, are enough to account for the neglect. Even the easy-mannered England of 1760 opened its eyes in horror when Tristram Shandy appeared. A most unclerical clergyman, the public pronounced the rector of Sutton and prebendary of York. Besides, his style was rambling to the last degree. Plot concerned him least of all authors of fiction. For instance, it is more than doubtful that the whimsical parson really intended a moral to be read into the adventures of his sentimental journey that follow in these pages. He used to declare that he never intended anything, he never knew whither his pen was leading. The rash implement, once in hand, was likely to fly with him from Yorkshire to Italy, or to Paris, or across the road to Uncle Toby's. And what could the helpless author do but improve each occasion? So here is one such occasion thus improved by disjointed sequels, heedless, one would say, and yet glittering with the unreturnable thrust of subtle wit, or softening with simple emotion, like 1,000 immortal passages of this random philosopher. Even the slightest turns of Sterne's pen bear inspiration. No less a critic than the severe Hazlitt was satisfied that his works consist only of brilliant passages. And because the editors of the present volumes found added to the mystery not only a solution, but an application of worldly wisdom, and a contrast in Sterne's best vein of quiet happiness, they have felt emboldened to ascribe the passage A Mystery with a Moral. As regards the application, Sterne knew whereof he wrote. He sought the south of France for health in 1762, and was run after and feted by the most brilliant circles of Parisian littérateurs. This foreign sojourn failed to cure his long complaint, but suggested the idea to him of the rambling and charming sentimental journey. Only 3 weeks after its publication, on March 18, 1768, Sterne died alone in his London lodgings. Spite of all that marred his genius, his work has lived and will live, if only for the exquisite literary art which ever made great things out of little. The Editor. A Mystery with a Moral, Parisian Experience of Parson Yorick on his Sentimental Journey. A Riddle. I remained at the gate of the hotel for some time, looking at every one who passed by, and forming conjectures upon them, till my attention got fixed upon a single object, which confounded all kind of reasoning upon him. It was a tall figure of a philosophic, serious adult look, which passed and repassed sedately along the street, making a turn of about 60 paces on each side of the gate of the hotel. The man was about 52, had a small cane under his arm, was dressed in a dark drab-colored coat, waistcoat, and breeches, which seemed to have seen some years' service. They were still clean, and there was a little air of frugal propriété throughout him. By his pulling off his hat, and his attitude of accosting a good many in his way, I saw he was asking charity. So I got a sous or two out of my pocket, ready to give him as he took me in his turn. He passed by me without asking anything, and yet he did not go 5 steps farther before he asked charity of a little woman. I was much more likely to have given of the two. He had scarce done with the woman, when he pulled his hat off to another who was coming the same way. An ancient gentleman came slowly, and after him a young smart one. He let them both pass, and asked nothing. I stood observing him half an hour, in which time he had made a dozen turns backward and forward, and found that he invariably pursued the same plan. There were two things very singular in this which set my brain to work, and to no purpose. The first was, why the man should only tell his story to the sex; and secondly, what kind of a story it was, and what species of eloquence it could be, which softened the hearts of the women which he knew it was to no purpose to practise upon the men. There were two other circumstances which entangled this mystery. The one was, he told every woman what he had to say in her ear, and in a way which had much more the air of a secret than a petition. The other was, it was always successful. He never stopped a woman, but she pulled out her purse and immediately gave him something. I could form no system to explain the phenomenon. I had got a riddle to amuse me for the rest of the evening, so I walked upstairs to my chamber. Overheard. The man who either disdains or fears to walk up a dark entry may be an excellent, good man, and fit for 100 things, but he will not do to make a sentimental traveller. I count little of the many things I see pass at broad noonday, in large and open streets. Nature is shy, and hates to act before spectators. But in such an unobservable corner you sometimes see a single short scene of hers, worth all the sentiments of a dozen French plays compounded together. And yet they are absolutely fine, and whenever I have a more brilliant affair upon my hands than common, as they suit a preacher just as well as a hero, I generally make my sermon out of them, and for the text, Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, is as good as any one in the Bible. There is a long, dark passage issuing out from the Opéra Comique into a narrow street. It is trod by a few who humbly wait for a fiacre, note, hackney coach, end of note, or wish to get off quietly afoot when the opera is done. At the end of it, toward the theatre, 'tis lighted by a small candle, the light of which is almost lost before you get halfway down, but near the door, it is more for ornament than use, you see it as a fixed star of the least magnitude. It burns, but does little good to the world that we know of. In returning from the opera, along this passage, I discerned, as I approached within 5 or 6 paces of the door, 2 ladies standing arm in arm, with their backs against the wall, waiting, as I imagined, for a fiacre. As they were next the door, I thought they had a prior right, so I edged myself up within a yard or little more of them, and quietly took my stand. I was in black and scarce seen. The lady next me was a tall, lean figure of a woman of about 36, the other of the same size and make of about 40. There was no mark of wife or widow in any one part of either of them. They seemed to be 2 upright Vestal sisters, unsapped by caresses, unbroken upon by tender salutations. I could have wished to have made them happy. Their happiness was destined, that night, to come from another quarter. A low voice with a good turn of expression and sweet cadence at the end of it, begged for a 12-sous piece between them for the love of heaven. I thought it singular that a beggar should fix the quota of an alms, and that the sum should be 12 times as much as what is usually given in the dark. They both seemed astonished at it as much as myself. 12 sous, said one. A 12-sous piece, said the other, and made no reply. The poor man said he knew not how to ask less of ladies of their rank, and bowed down his head to the ground. Pooh, said they, we have no money. The beggar remained silent for a moment or two, and renewed his supplication. Do not, my fair young ladies, said he, stop your good ears against me. Upon my word, honest man, said the younger, we have no change. Then God bless you, said the poor man, and multiply those joys which you can give to others without change. I observed the older sister put her hand into her pocket. I will see, said she, if I have a sou. A sou? Give 12, said the suppliant. Nature has been bountiful to you, be bountiful to a poor man. I would, friend, with all my heart, said the younger, if I had it. My fair charitable, said he, addressing himself to the elder, what is it but your goodness and humanity which make your bright eyes so sweet that they outshine the morning even in this dark passage? And what was it which made the Marquis de Santerre and his brother say so much of you both, as they just passed by?" The two ladies seemed much affected, and impulsively at the same time they put their hands into their pockets and each took out a 12-sou piece. The contest between them and the poor suppliant was no more. It was continued between themselves which of the two should give the 12-sou piece in charity, and, to end the dispute, they both gave it together, and the man went away. Solution. I stepped hastily after him. It was the very man whose success in asking charity of the woman before the door of the hotel had so puzzled me, and I found at once his secret, or at least the basis of it. It was flattery. Delicious essence! How refreshing art thou to nature! How strongly are all its powers and all its weaknesses on thy side! How sweetly dost thou mix with the blood, and help it through the most difficult and tortuous passages to the heart! The poor man, as he was not straitened for time, had given it here in a larger dose. It is certainly he had a way of bringing it into less form for the many sudden causes he had to do with in the streets. But how he contrived to correct, sweeten, concenter, and qualify it, I vex not my spirit with the inquiry. It is enough, the beggar gained 2 12-sou pieces, and they can best tell the rest who have gained much greater matters by it. Application. We get forward in the world not so much by doing services as receiving them. You take a withering twig and put it in the ground, and then you water it because you have planted it. Monsieur le Comte de B, merely because he had done me one kindness in the affair of my passport, would go on and do me another the few days he was at Paris, in making me known to a few people of rank. And they were to present me to others, and so on. I had got master of my secret just in time to turn those honors to some little account. Otherwise, as is commonly the case, I should have dined or supped a single time or two round, and then by translating French looks and attitudes into plain English, I should presently have seen that I had got hold of the couvert, note, plate, napkin, knife, fork, and spoon, of some more entertaining guest, and in course of time should have resigned all my places one after another, merely upon the principle that I could not keep them. As it was, things did not go much amiss. I had the honor of being introduced to the old Marquis de B. In days of yore he had signalized himself, by some small feats of chivalry, in the Cour d'Amour, and had dressed himself out to the idea of tilts and tournaments ever since. The Marquis de B wished to have it, thought the affair was somewhere else than in his brain. He could like to take a trip to England, and asked much of the English ladies. "Stay where you are, I beseech you, Monsieur le Marquis," said I. "Les messieurs Anglais can scarce get a kind look from them as it is." The Marquis invited me to supper. Monsieur P, the farmer general, was just as inquisitive about our taxes. They were very considerable, he heard. "If we knew but how to collect them," said I, making him a low bow. I could never have been invited to Monsieur P.'s concerts, upon any other terms. I had been misrepresented to Madame de Q as an esprit. Madame de Q was an esprit herself. She burnt with impatience to see me and hear me talk. I had not taken my seat before I saw she did not care a sou whether I had any wit or no. I was let in to be convinced she had. I call heaven to witness I never once opened the door of my lips. Madame de V vowed to every creature she met she had never had a more improving conversation with a man in her life. There are 3 epochs in the empire of a Frenchwoman. She is coquette, then deist, then devote. The empire during these is never lost, she only changes her subjects. When 35 years and more have unpeopled her dominion of the slaves of love, she repeoples it with slaves of infidelity, and then with the slaves of the church. Madame de V was vibrating between the first of these epochs. The color of the rose was fading fast away. She ought to have been a deist 5 years before the time I had the honor to pay my first visit. She placed me upon the same sofa with her for the sake of disputing the point of religion more closely. In short, Madame de V told me she believed nothing. I told Madame de V it might be her principle, but I was sure it could not be her interest, to level the outworks, without which I could not conceive how such a citadel as hers could be defended; that there was not a more dangerous thing in the world than for a beauty to be a deist; and it was a debt I owed my creed not to conceal it from her; that I had not been 5 minutes upon the sofa beside her before I had begun to form designs; and what is it but the sentiments of religion and the persuasion they had existed in her breast, which could have checked them as they rose up? "We are not adamant," said I, taking hold of her hand, "and there is need of all restraints till age in her own time steals in and lays them on us. But, my dear lady," said I, kissing her hand, "it is too soon." I declare I had the credit all over Paris of unperverting Madame de V. She affirmed to Monsieur D and the Abbé M that in 1/2 hour I had said more for revealed religion than all the encyclopaedia had said against it. I was listed directly into Madame de V.'s coterie, and she put off the epoch of deism for 2 years. I remember it was in this coterie, in the middle of a discourse, in which I was showing the necessity of a first cause, that the young Count de Faineant took me by the hand to the farthest corner of the room, to tell me that my solitaire was pinned too straight about my neck. "It should be plus badinant," said the Count, looking down upon his own. "But a word, Monsieur Yorick, to the wise." "And from the wise, Monsieur le Comte," replied I, making him a bow, "is enough." The Count de Faineant embraced me with more ardor than ever I was embraced by mortal man. For 3 weeks together I was of every man's opinion I met. "Pardi, ce Monsieur Yorick a autant d'esprit que nous autres." "Il raisonne bien," said another. "C'est un bon enfant," said a third. And at this price I could have eaten and drunk and been merry all the days of my life at Paris. But it was a dishonest reckoning. I grew ashamed of it. It was the gain of a slave. Every sentiment of honor revolted against it. The higher I got, the more was I forced upon my beggarly system. The better the coterie, the more children of art, I languished for those of nature. And one night, after a most vile prostitution of myself to 6 different people, I grew sick, went to bed, and ordered horses in the morning to set out for Italy. Contrast. A shoe coming loose from the forefoot of the thill horse at the beginning of the ascent of Mount Taurira, the postilion dismounted, twisted the shoe off, and put it in his pocket. As the ascent was of 5 or 6 miles, and that horse our main dependence, I made a point of having the shoe fastened on again, as well as we could, but the postilion had thrown away the nails, and the hammer in the chaise box being of no great use without them, I submitted to go on. He had not mounted 1/2 mile higher when, coming to a flinty piece of road, the poor devil lost a second shoe, and from off his other forefoot. I then got out of the chaise in good earnest, and seeing a house about 1/4 mile to the left hand, with a great deal to do I prevailed upon the postilion to turn up to it. The look of the house, and of everything about it, as we drew nearer, soon reconciled me to the disaster. It was a little farmhouse, surrounded with about 20 acres of vineyard, about as much corn, and close to the house on one side was a potagerie of 1 acre and a half, full of everything which could make plenty in a French peasant's house, and on the other side was a little wood which furnished wherewithal to dress it. It was about 8 in the evening when I got to the house, so I left the postilion to manage his point as he could, and for mine I walked directly into the house. The family consisted of an old grey-headed man and his wife, with 5 or 6 sons and sons-in-laws, and their several wives, and a joyous genealogy out of them. They were all sitting down together to their lentil soup. A large wheaten loaf was in the middle of the table, and a flagon of wine at each end of it promised joy through the stages of the repast. It was a feast of love. The old man rose up to meet me, and with a respectful cordiality would have me sit down at the table. My heart was set down the moment I entered the room, so I sat down at once like a son of the family, and to invest myself in the character as speedily as I could, I instantly borrowed the old man's knife, and taking up the loaf cut myself a hearty luncheon, and, as I did it, I saw a testimony in every eye, not only of an honest welcome, but of a welcome mixed with thanks that I had not seemed to doubt it. Was it this, or tell me, Nature, what else it was, that made this morsel so sweet, and to what magic I owe it that the draught I took of their flagon was so delicious with it that they remain upon my palate to this hour? If the supper was to my taste, the grace which followed it was much more so. When supper was over, the old man gave a knock upon the table with the haft of his knife, to bid them prepare for the dance. The moment the signal was given, the women and girls ran all together into a back apartment, to tie up their hair, and the young men to the door to wash their faces and change their sabots, and in 3 minutes every soul was ready upon the little esplanade before the house, to begin. The old man and his wife came out last, and, placing me betwixt them, sat down upon a sofa of turf by the door. The old man had some 50 years ago been no mean performer upon the vielle, note, a small violin such as was used by the wandering jongleur of the Middle Age, editor. End of note. And at the age he was then of, touched well enough for the purpose. His wife sung now and then a little to the tune, then intermitted and joined her old man again, as their children and grandchildren danced before them. It was not till the middle of the second dance when, from some pauses in the movement wherein they all seemed to look up, I fancied I could distinguish an elevation of spirit different from that which is the cause or the effect of simple jollity. In a word, I thought I beheld religion mixing in the dance, but, as I had never seen her so engaged, I should have looked upon it now as one of the illusions of an imagination, which is eternally misleading me, had not the old man, as soon as the dance ended, said that this was their constant way, and that all his life long he had made it a rule, after supper was over, to call out his family to dance and rejoice, believing, he said, that a cheerful and contented mind was the best sort of thanks to heaven that an illiterate peasant could pay. Or a learned prelate either, said I. When you have gained the top of Mount Taurira, you run presently down to Lyons. Adieu then to all rapid movements. It is a journey of caution, and it fares better with sentiments not to be in a hurry with them, so I contracted with the Voltarin to take his time with a couple of mules, and convey me in my own chaise safe to Turin through Savoy. Poor, patient, quiet, honest people, fear not. Your poverty, the treasury of your simple virtues, will not be envied you by the world, nor will your values be invaded by it. Nature, in the midst of thy disorders, thou art still friendly to the scantiness thou hast created. With all thy great works about thee little hast thou left to give, either to the scythe or to the sickle, but to that little thou grantest safety and protection, and sweet are the dwellings which stand so sheltered. End of section 14.
Section 15 of Library of the World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Library of the World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 3, by Julian Hawthorne, Editor. Section 15. On Being Found Out, by William Makepeace Thackeray. At the close, let us say, of Queen Anne's reign, when I was a boy at a private and preparatory school for young gentlemen, I remember the wiseacre of a master ordering us all one night to march into a little garden at the back of the house, and thence to proceed one by one into a tool or hen house. I was but a tender little thing just put into short clothes, and can't exactly say whether the house was for tools or hens. And in that house to put our hands into a sack, which stood on a bench, a candle burning beside it. I put my hand into the sack. My hand came out quite black. I went and joined the other boys in the schoolroom, and all their hands were black too. By reason of my tender age, and there are some critics who, I hope, will be satisfied by my acknowledging that I am 156 next birthday. I could not understand what was the meaning of this night excursion, this candle, this tool house, this bag of soot. I think we little boys were taken out of our sleep to be brought to the ordeal. We came then and showed our little hands to the master. Washed them or not, most probably I should say not, and so went bewildered back to bed. Something had been stolen in the school that day, and Mr. Wiseacre, having read in a book of an ingenious method of finding out a thief by making him put his hand into a sack, which, if guilty, the rogue would shirk from doing. All we boys were subjected to the trial. Goodness knows what the lost object was, or who stole it. We all had black hands to show the master, and the thief, whoever he was not found out that time. I wonder if the rascal is alive. An elderly scoundrel he must be by this time, and a hoary old hypocrite to whom an old schoolfellow presents his kindest regards, parenthetically remarking what a dreadful place that private school was. Cold, chilblains, bad dinners, not enough victuals, and caning awful. Are you alive still, I say, you nameless villain who escaped discovery on that day of crime? I hope you have escaped often since, old sinner. Ah, what a lucky thing it is, for you and me, my man, that we are not found out in all our peccadilloes, and that our backs can slip away from the master and the cane. Just consider what life would be if every rogue was found out and flogged coram populo. What a butchery, what an indecency, what an endless swishing of the rod. Don't cry out about my misanthropy. My good friend Mealy-mouth, I will trouble you to tell me, do you go to church? When there, do you say, or do you not, that you are a miserable sinner, and saying so, do you believe or disbelieve it? If you are a miserable sinner, don't you deserve correction, and aren't you grateful if you are to be let off? I say again, what a blessed thing it is that we are not all found out. Just picture to yourself everybody who does wrong being found out, and punished accordingly. Fancy all the boys in all the school being whipped, and then the assistants, and then the headmaster, Dr. Badford, let us call him. Fancy the provost marshal being tied up, having previously superintended the correction of the whole army. After the young gentlemen have had their turn for their faulty exercises, fancy Dr. Lincoln's Inn being taken up for certain faults in his essay and review. After the clergyman has cried his Peccavi, suppose we hoist up a bishop, and give him a couple of dozen. I see my Lord Bishop of Double Gloucester sitting in a very uneasy posture on his right reverend bench. After we have cast off the bishop, what are we to say to the minister who appointed him? My Lord Sinkwarden, it is painful to have to use personal correction to a boy of your age, but really, siste tandem carnifex. The butchery is too horrible. The hand drops powerless, appalled at the quantity of birch which it must cut and brandish. I am glad we are not all found out, I say again, and protest, my dear brethren, against our having our deserts. To fancy all men found out and punished is bad enough, but imagine all the women found out in the distinguished social circle in which you and I have the honor to move. Is it not a mercy that many of these fair criminals remain unpunished and undiscovered? There is Mrs. Longbow, who is forever practicing, and who shoots poisoned arrows too. When you meet her, you don't call her a liar, and charge her with the wickedness she has done and is doing. There is Mrs. Painter, who passes for a most respectable woman, and a model in society. There is no use in saying what you really know regarding her and her goings-on. There is Diana Hunter, What a little haughty prude it is! And yet we know stories about her which are not altogether edifying. I say it best, for the sake of the good, that the bad should not all be found out. You don't want your children to know the history of that lady in the next box, who is so handsome, and whom they admire so. Ah me, what would life be if we were all found out and punished for all our faults? Jack Ketch would be in permanence, and then who would hang Jack Ketch? They talk of murderers being pretty certainly found out. Pshaw! I have heard an authority awfully competent vow and declare that scores and hundreds of murders are committed, and nobody is the wiser. That terrible man mentioned 1 or 2 ways of committing murder, which he maintained were quite common, and were scarcely ever found out. A man, for instance, comes home to his wife, and... But I pause. I know that this magazine has a very large circulation. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands, why not say 1,000,000 of people at once? Well, say 1,000,000 read it. And among these countless readers, I might be teaching some monster how to make away with his wife without being found out, some fiend of a woman how to destroy her dear husband. I will not then tell this easy and simple way of murder, as communicated to me by a most respectable party in the confidence of private intercourse. Suppose some gentle reader were to try this most simple and easy receipt, it seems to me almost infallible, and come to grief in consequence, and be found out and hanged. Should I ever pardon myself for having been the means of doing injury to a single one of our esteemed subscribers? The prescription whereof I speak, that is to say, whereof I don't speak, shall be buried in this bosom. No, I am a humane man. I am not one of your Bluebeards to go and say to my wife, "My dear, I am going away for a few days to Brighton. Here are all the keys to the house. You may open every door and closet except the one at the end of the oak room opposite the fireplace, with the little bronze Shakespeare on the mantelpiece," or what not. I don't say this to a woman, unless to be sure I want to get rid of her, because after such a caution I know she'll peep into the closet. I say nothing about the closet at all. I keep the key in my pocket, and a being whom I love, but who, as I know, has many weaknesses, out of harm's way. You toss up your head, dear angel, drub on the ground with your lovely little feet, on the table with your sweet rosy fingers, and cry, "Oh, sneerer, you don't know the depth of woman's feeling, the lofty scorn of all deceit, the entire absence of mean curiosity in the sex, or never, never would you libel us so." Ah, Delia, dear, dear Delia, it is because I fancy I do know something about you. Not all, mind. No, no, no man knows that. Ah, my bride, my ring-dove, my rose, my poppet. Choose, in fact, whatever name you like. Bulbul of my grove, fountain of my desert, sunshine of my darkling life, and joy of my dungeoned existence. It is because I do know a little about you that I conclude to say nothing of that private closet, and keep my key in my pocket. You take away that closet key, then, and the house key. You lock Delia in. You keep her out of harm's way and gadding, and so she never can be found out. And yet by little strange accidents and coincidence, how we are being found out every day. You remember that old story of the Abbé Cucados, who told the company at supper one night how the first confession he ever received was from a murderer, let us say. Presently enters to supper the Marquis de Croquet-Mitaine. "Palsambleu, Abbé," says the brilliant Marquis, taking a pinch of snuff. "Are you here? Gentlemen and ladies, I was the Abbé's first penitent, and I made him a confession which I promise you astonished him." To be sure, how queerly things are found out. Here is an instance. Only the other day I was writing in these roundabout papers about a certain man, whom I facetiously called Baggs, and who had abused me to my friends, who, of course, told me. Shortly after that paper was published, another friend, Sax let us call him, scowls fiercely at me as I am sitting in a perfect good humour at the club, and passes on without speaking. A cut, a quarrel. Sax thinks it is about him that I was writing, whereas upon my honour and conscience I never had him once in my mind, and was pointing my moral from quite another man. But don't you see, by this wrath of the guilty conscienced Sax, that he had been abusing me too? He has owned himself guilty, never having been accused. He has winced when nobody thought of hitting him. I did but put the cap out, and madly butting and chafing, behold my friend rushes out to put his head into it. Never mind, Sax, you are found out. But I bear you no malice, my man. And yet to be found out, I know from my own experience, must be painful and odious and cruelly mortifying to the inward vanity. Suppose I am a poltroon, let us say, with fierce moustache, loud talk, plentiful oaths, and an immense stick. I keep up nevertheless a character for courage. I swear fearfully at cabmen and women, brandish my bludgeon, and perhaps knock down a little man or two with it. Brag of the images which I break at the shooting gallery, and pass among my friends for a whiskey fire-eater, afraid of neither man nor dragon. Ah me! Suppose some brisk little chap steps up and gives me a caning in St. James Street, with all the heads of my friends looking out of all the club windows. My reputation is gone. I frighten no man more. My nose is pulled by whippersnappers who jump up on a chair to reach it. I am found out. And in the days of my triumphs, when people were yet afraid of me, and were taken in by my swagger, I always knew that I was a lily liver, and expected that I should be found out some day. That certainty of being found out must haunt and depress many a bold braggadocio spirit. Let us say it is a clergyman, who can pump copious floods of tears out of his own eyes and those of his audience. He thinks to himself, I am but a poor swindling, chattering rogue. My bills are unpaid. I have jilted several women whom I have promised to marry. I don't know whether I believe what I preach, and I know I have stolen the very sermon over which I have been snivelling. Have they found me out? Says he, as his head drops down on the cushion. Then you're writer, poet, historian, novelist, or what not. The Beacon says that Jones's work is one of the first order. The Lamp declares that Jones's tragedy surpasses every work since the days of him of Avon. The Comet asserts that Jay's Life of Goody Two-Shoes is a noble and enduring monument to the fame of that admirable Englishwoman, and so forth. But then Jones knows that he has lent the critic of the Beacon £5, that his publisher has half a share in the Lamp, and that the Comet comes repeatedly to dine with him. It is all very well. Jones is immortal until he is found out, and then down comes the extinguisher, and the immortal is dead and buried. The idea of discovery must haunt many a man, and make him uneasy as the trumpets are puffing in his triumph. Brown, who has a higher place than he deserves, cowers before Smith, who has found him out. What is the chorus of critics shouting? Bravo! A public clapping hands and flinging garlands? Brown knows that Smith has found him out. Puff, trumpets, wave banners. Huzza, boys, for the immortal Brown. This is all very well, Brown thinks, bowing the while, smiling, laying his hand to his heart. But there stands Smith at the window. He has measured me, and some day the others will find me out too. It is a very curious sensation to sit by a man who has found you out, and who, as you know, has found you out. Or, vice versa, to sit with a man whom you have found out. His talent? Bah! His virtue. We know a little story or two about his virtue, and he knows we know it. We are thinking over friend Robinson's antecedents as we grin, bow, and talk, and we are both humbugs together. Robinson is a good fellow, is he? You know how he behaved to Hicks? A good-natured man, is he? Pray, do you remember that little story of Mrs. Robinson's black eye? How men have to work, to talk, to smile, to go to bed and try and sleep, with this dread of being found out on their consciences. Bardolph, who has robbed a church, and Nym, who has taken a purse, go to their usual haunts, and smoke their pipes with their companions. Mr. Detective Bullseye appears, and says, "Oh, Bardolph, I want you about that there Pix business." Mr. Bardolph knocks the ashes out of his pipe, puts out his hands to the little steel cuffs, and walks away, quite meekly. He is found out. He must go. Good-bye, Doll Tearsheet. Good-bye, Mrs. Quickly, ma'am. The other gentlemen and ladies de la société look on and exchange mute adieux with the departing friends, and an assured time will come when the other gentlemen and ladies will be found out too. What a wonderful and beautiful provision of nature it has been, that for the most part our womankind are not endowed with the faculty of finding us out. They don't doubt, and probe, and weigh, and take your measure. Lay down this paper, my benevolent friend and reader. Go into your drawing-room now, and utter a joke ever so old, and I wager 6pence the ladies there will all begin to laugh. Go to Brown's house and tell Mrs. Brown and the young ladies what you think of him, and see what a welcome you will get. In like manner, let him come to your house, and tell your good lady his candid opinion of you, and fancy how she will receive him. Would you have your wife and children know you exactly for what you are, and esteem you precisely at your worth? If so, my friend, you will live in a dreary house, and you will have but a chilly fireside. Do you suppose the people round it don't see your homely face as under a glamour, and as it were with a halo of love round it? You don't fancy you are as you seem to them. No such thing, my man. Put away that monstrous conceit, and be thankful that they have not found you out. End of section 15. Recording by Rhonda Federman.
Section 16 of Library of the World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by drewpiston. Library of the World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 3, by Julian Hawthorne, editor. Section 16, The Pipe, by Anonymous. Randolph Crescent, N.W. My dear Pugh, I hope you will like the pipe which I send with this. It is rather a curious example of a certain school of Indian carving, and is a present from yours truly, Joseph Tress. It was really very handsome of Tress, very handsome, the more especially as I was aware that to give presents was not exactly in Tress's line. The truth is that when I saw what manner of pipe it was, I was amazed. It was contained in a sandalwood box, which was itself with some remarkable specimens of carving. I use the word remarkable advisedly, because, although the workmanship was undoubtedly, in its way, artistic, the result could not be described as beautiful. The carver had thought proper to ornament the box with some of the ugliest figures I remember to have seen. They appeared to me to be devils. Or perhaps they were intended to represent deities appertaining to some mythological system with which, thank goodness, I am unacquainted. The pipe itself was worthy of the case in which it was contained. It was of meerschaum with an amber mouthpiece. It was rather too large for ordinary smoking, but then, of course, One doesn't smoke a pipe like that. There are pipes in my collection which I should as soon think of smoking as I should of eating. Ask a China maniac to let you have afternoon tea out of his old Chelsea, and you will learn some home truths as to the durability of human friendships. The glory of the pipe, as Tress had suggested, lay in its carving. Not that I claim that it was beautiful, any more than I make such a claim for the carving on the box, but, as Tress said in his note, it was curious. The stem and the bowl were quite plain, but on the edge of the bowl was perched some kind of lizard. I told myself it was an octopus when I first saw it, but I have since had reason to believe that it was some almost unique member of the lizard tribe. The creature was represented as climbing over the edge of the bowl down toward the stem, and its legs, or feelers, or tentacula, or whatever the things are called, were, if I may use a vulgarism, sprawling about all over the place. For instance, 2 or 3 of them were twined about the bowl, 2 or 3 of them were twisted round the stem, and one, a particularly horrible one, was uplifted in the air, so that if you put the pipe in your mouth, the thing was pointing straight at your nose. Not the least agreeable feature about the creature was that it was hideously lifelike. It appeared to have been carved in amber, but some coloring matter must have been introduced, for inside the amber the creature was of a peculiarly ghastly green. The more I examined the pipe, the more amazed I was at Tress's generosity. He and I are rival collectors. I'm not going to say, in so many words, that his collection of pipes contains nothing but rubbish, because, as a matter of fact, he has 2 or 3 rather decent specimens. But to compare his collection to mine would be absurd. Tress is conscious of this, and he resents it. He resents it to such an extent that he has been known, at least on one occasion, to declare that one single pipe of his, I believe he alluded to the Brummagem relic preposterously attributed to Sir Walter Raleigh, was worth the whole of my collection put together. Although I have forgotten this, as I hope I always shall forgive remarks made when envious passions get the better of our nobler nature, even of a Joseph Tress, it is not to be supposed that I have forgotten it. He was, therefore, not at all the sort of person from whom I expected to receive a present. And such a present! I do not believe that he himself had a finer pipe in his collection, and to have given it to me, I had misjudged the man. I wondered where he had got it from. I had seen his pipes, I knew them off by heart, and some nice trumpery he has among them too, but I had never seen that pipe before. The more I looked at it, the more my amazement grew. The beast perched upon the edge of the bowl was so lifelike. Its 2 bead-like eyes seemed to gleam at me with positively human intelligence. The pipe fascinated to such an extent that I actually resolved to smoke it. I filled it with perique. Ordinarily I use bird's eye, but on those very rare occasions on which I use a specimen, I smoke perique. I lit it up with a small sensation of excitement. As I did so, I kept my eyes perforce fixed upon the beast. The beast pointed its upraised tentacle directly at me. As I inhaled the pungent tobacco, that tentacle impressed me with a feeling of actual uncanniness. It was broad daylight, and I was smoking in front of the window, yet to such an extent was I affected that it seemed to me that the tentacle was not only vibrating, which, owing to the peculiarity of its position, was quite within the range of probability, but actually moving, elongating, stretching forward, that is, farther toward me and toward the tip of my nose. So impressed was I by this idea that I took the pipe out of my mouth and minutely examined the beast. Really, the delusion was excusable. So cunningly had the artist wrought that he succeeded in producing a creature which, such was its uncanniness, I could only hope, had no original in nature. Replacing the pipe between my lips, I took several whiffs. Never had smoking had such an effect on me before. Either the pipe or the creature on it exercised some singular fascination. I seemed, without an instant's warning, to be passing into some land of dreams. I saw the beast, which was perched upon the bowl, writhe and twist. I saw it lift itself bodily from the meerschaum. "Feeling better now?" I looked up. Joseph Tress was speaking. "What's the matter? Have I been ill?" "You appear to have been in some kind of swoon." Tress's tone was peculiar, even a little dry. "Swoon? I never was guilty of such a thing in my life." "Nor was I, until I smoked that pipe." I sat up. The act of sitting up made me conscious of the fact that I had been lying down. Conscious, too, that I was feeling more than a little dazed. It seemed as though I was waking out of some strange, lethargic sleep, a kind of feeling which I have read of and heard about, but never before experienced. Where am I? You're on the couch in your own room. You were on the floor, but I thought it would be better to pick you up and place you on the couch, though no one performed the same kind office to me when I was on the floor. Again, Tress's tone was distinctly dry. How came you here? Ah, that's the question. He rubbed his chin, a habit of his which has annoyed me more than once before. Do you think you're sufficiently recovered to enable you to understand a simple explanation? I stared at him, amazed. He went on stroking his chin. The truth is that when I sent you the pipe, I made a slight omission. An omission? I omitted to advise you not to smoke it. And why? Because, well, I've reason to believe the thing is drugged. Drugged or poisoned. Poisoned. I was wide awake enough then. I jumped off the couch with a celerity which proved it. It is this way. I became its owner in rather a singular manner. He paused, as if for me to make a remark, but I was silent. It is not often that I smoke a specimen, but for some reason I did smoke this. I commenced to smoke it, that is. How long I continued to smoke it is more than I can say. It had on me the same peculiar effect which it appears to have had on you. When I recovered consciousness, I was lying on the floor. On the floor? On the floor. In about as uncomfortable a position as you can easily conceive. I was lying face downward with my legs bent under me. I was never so surprised in my life as when I found myself where I was. At first I supposed that I had had a stroke, but by degrees it dawned upon me that I didn't feel as though I had had a stroke. Tress, by the way, has been an army surgeon. I was conscious of distinct nausea. Looking about, I saw the pipe. With me it had fallen on the floor. I took it for granted, considering the delicacy of the carving, that the fall had broken it, but when I picked it up, I found it quite uninjured. While I was examining it, a thought flashed to my brain. Might it not be answerable for what had happened to me? Suppose, for instance, it was drugged. I had heard of such things. Besides, in my case, were present all the symptoms of drug poisoning, though what drug had been used I couldn't in the least conceive. I resolved that I would give the pipe another trial. On yourself, or on another party, meaning me? On myself, my dear Pugh, on myself. At that point of my investigations, I had not begun to think of you. I lit it up and had another smoke. With what result? Well, that depends on the standpoint from which you regard the whole thing. From one point of view, the result was wholly satisfactory. I proved that the thing was drugged, and more. Did you have another fall? I did, and something else besides. On that account, I presume, you resolved to pass the treasure on to me. Partly on that account, and partly on another. On my word, I appreciate your generosity. You might have labeled the thing as poison. Exactly. But then you must remember how often you have told me that you never smoke your specimens. That was no reason why you shouldn't have given me a hint that the thing was more dangerous than dynamite. That did occur to me afterwards. Therefore, I called to supply the slight omission. Slight omission, you call it. I wonder what you would have called it if you had found me dead. If I had known that you intended smoking it, I should not have been at all surprised if I had. Really, Tress, I appreciate your kindness more and more. Where is this example of your splendid benevolence? Have you pocketed it, regretting your lapse in the unaccustomed paths of generosity, or is it smashed to atoms? Neither the one nor the other. You will find the pipe upon the table. I neither desire its restoration, nor is it in any way injured. It is merely an expression of personal opinion when I say that I don't believe that it could be injured. Of course, having discovered its deleterious properties, you will not want to smoke it again. You will therefore be able to enjoy the consciousness of being the possessor of what I honestly believe to be the most remarkable pipe in existence. Good day, Pugh. He was gone before I could say a word. I immediately concluded from the precipitancy of his flight that the pipe was injured, but when I subjected it to close examination I could discover no signs of damage. While I was still eyeing it with jealous scrutiny, the door reopened, and Tress came in again. "By the way, Pugh, there's one thing I might mention, especially as I know it won't make any difference to you." "That depends on what it is. If you have changed your mind and want the pipe back again, I tell you frankly that it won't. In my opinion, a thing once given is given for good." "Quite so. I don't want it back again." "You may make your mind easy on that point. I merely wanted to tell you why I gave it to you." "You have told me that already." "Only partly, my dear Pugh, only partly. You don't suppose I should have given you such a pipe as that merely because it happened to be drugged? Scarcely. I gave it to you because I discovered from indisputable evidence, and to my cost, that it was haunted." "Haunted?" "Yes, haunted. Good day." He was gone again. I ran out of the room and shouted after him down the stairs. He was already at the bottom of the flight. "Tress, come back! What do you mean by talking such nonsense?" "Of course it's only nonsense. We know that sort of thing always is nonsense. But if you should have any reason to suppose that there is something in it besides nonsense, you may think it worth your while to make inquiries of me. But I won't have that pipe back again in my possession on any terms. Mind that." The bang of the front door told me that he had gone out into the street. I let him go. I laughed to myself as I re-entered the room. Haunted! That was not a bad idea of his. I saw the whole position at a glance. The truth of the matter was that he did regret his generosity, and he was ready to go to any lengths if he could only succeed in cajoling me into restoring his gift. He was aware that I have views upon certain matters which are not wholly in accordance with those which are popularly supposed to be the views of the day, and particularly that on the question of what are commonly called supernatural visitations I have a standpoint of my own. Therefore, it was not a bad move on his part to try to make me believe that about the pipe on which he knew I had set my heart there was something which could not be accounted for by ordinary laws. Yet, as his own sense would have told him it would do, if he had only allowed himself to reflect for a moment, the move failed, because I am not yet so far gone as to suppose that a pipe, a thing of meerschaum and amber, in the sense in which I understand the word, could be haunted. A pipe, a mere pipe. Hullo! I thought the creature's legs were twined right round the bowl. I was holding the pipe in my hand, regarding it with the affectionate eyes with which a connoisseur does regard a curio, when I induced to make this exclamation. I was certainly under the impression that, when I first took the pipe out of the box, 2, if not 3 of the feelers had been twined about the bowl, twined tightly, so that you could not see daylight between them and it. Now they were almost entirely detached, only the tips touching the meerschaum, and those particular feelers were gathered up as though the creature were in the act of taking a spring. Of course I was under misapprehension. The feelers couldn't have been twined. A moment before I should have been ready to bet 1,000 to 1 that they were. Still, one does make mistakes, and very egregious mistakes at times. At the same time, I confess that when I saw that dreadful-looking animal poised on the extreme edge of the bowl, for all the world as though it were just going to spring at me, I was a little startled. I remembered that when I was smoking the pipe, I did think I saw the uplifted tentacle moving, as though it were reaching out to me, and I had a clear recollection that just as I had been sinking into that strange state of unconsciousness, I had been under the impression that the creature was writhing and twisting, as though it had suddenly become instinct with life. Under the circumstances, these reflections were not pleasant. I wish Tress had not talked that nonsense about the thing being haunted. It was surely sufficient to know that it was drugged and poisonous without anything else. I replaced it in the sandalwood box. I locked the box in a cabinet. Quite apart from the question as to whether that pipe was or was not haunted, I know it haunted me. It was with me in a figurative, which was worse than actual, sense all the day. Still worse, it was with me all the night. It was with me in my dreams, such dreams. Possibly I had not yet wholly recovered from the effects of that insidious drug. But, whether or no, it was very wrong of Tress to set my thoughts into such a channel. He knows that I am of a highly imaginative temperament, and that it is easier to get morbid thoughts into my mind than to get them out again. Before that night was through, I wished very heartily that I had never seen the pipe. I woke from one nightmare to fall into another. One dreadful dream was with me all the time, of a hideous green reptile which advanced toward me out of some awful darkness, slowly, inch by inch, until it clutched me round the neck and, gluing its lips to mine, sucked the life's blood out of my veins as it embraced me with a slimy kiss. Such dreams are not restful. I woke anything but refreshed when the morning came, and when I got up and dressed, I felt that, on the whole, it would perhaps have been better if I never had gone to bed. My nerves were unstrung, and I had that generally tremulous feeling which is, I believe, an inseparable companion of the more advanced stages of dipsomnia. I ate no breakfast. I am no breakfast eater as a rule, but that morning I ate absolutely nothing. If this sort of thing is to continue, I will let Tress have his pipe again. He may have the laugh of me, but anything is better than this. It was with almost funeral forebodings that I went to the cabinet in which I had placed the sandalwood box. But when I opened it, my feelings of gloom partially vanished. Of what fantasies had I been guilty? It must have been entire delusion on my part to suppose that those tentacula had ever been twined about the bowl. The creature was in exactly the same position in which I had left it the day before, as, of course, I knew it would be, poised as if about to spring. I was telling myself how foolish I had been to allow myself to dwell for a moment on Tress's words, when Martin Brasher was shown in. Brasher is an old friend of mine. We have a common ground, ghosts, only we approach them from different points of view. He takes the scientific, psychological inquiry side. He is always anxious to hear of a ghost, that he may have an opportunity of showing it up. "I have something in your line here," I observed as he came in. "In my line? How so? I'm not pipe mad." "No, but you're ghost mad, and this is a haunted pipe." "A haunted pipe? I think you're rather more mad about my ghosts, my dear Pugh, than I am." Then I told him all about it. He was deeply interested, especially when I told him that the pipe was drugged. But when I repeated Tress's words about its being haunted, and mentioned my own delusion about the creature moving, he took a more serious view of the case than I had expected he would do. I propose that we act on Tress's suggestion, and go and make inquiries of him. "But you don't really think that there is anything in it?" "On these subjects I never allow myself to think at all. There are Tress's words, and there is your story. It is agreed on all hands that the pipe has peculiar properties. It seems to me that there is a sufficient case here to merit inquiry." He persuaded me. I went with him. The pipe and the sandalwood box went too. Tress received us with a grin which was accentuated when I placed the sandalwood box on the table. "You understand," he said, "that a gift is a gift. On no terms will I consent to receive that pipe back in my possession." I was rather nettled by his tone. "You need be under no alarm. I have no intention of suggesting anything of the kind. Our business here," began Brasher, I must own that his manner is a little ponderous, "is of a scientific, I may say also, and at the same time, of a judicial nature. Our object is the pursuit of truth and the advancement of inquiry." "Have you been trying another smoke?" inquired Tress, nodding his head toward me. Before I had time to answer, Brasher went droning on. "Our friend here tells me that you say this pipe is haunted. I say it is haunted because it is haunted." I looked at Tress. I half suspected that he was poking fun at us, but he appeared to be serious enough. "In these matters," remarked Brasher, as though he were giving utterance to a new and important truth, "there is a scientific and a non-scientific method of inquiry. The scientific method is to begin at the beginning. I ask how this pipe came into your possession." Tress paused before he answered. "You may ask." He paused again. "Oh, you certainly may ask. But it doesn't follow that I shall tell you. Surely your object, like ours, can be but spreading about of the truth? I don't see it at all. It is possible to imagine a case in which the spreading about of the truth might make me look a little awkward. Indeed, Brasher pursed up his lips. Your words almost lead one to suppose that there was something about your method of acquiring the pipe which you have good and weighty reasons for concealing. I don't know why I should conceal the thing from you. I don't suppose either of you is any better than I am. I don't mind telling you how I got the pipe. I stole it. Stole it? Brasher seemed both amazed and shocked. But I, who had previous experience of Tress's methods of adding to his collection, was not at all surprised. Some of the pipes which he calls his, if only the whole truth about them were publicly known, would send him to jail. That's nothing, he continued. All collectors steal. The 8th commandment was not intended to apply to them. Why, Pew there has conveyed 3/4 of the pipe which he flatters himself are his. I was so dumbfounded by the charge that it took my breath away. I sat in an astounded silence. Tress went raving on. I was so shy of this particular pipe when I had obtained it that I put it away for quite 3 months. When I took it out to have a look at it, something about the thing so tickled me that I resolved to smoke it, owing to peculiar circumstances attending the manner in which the thing came into my possession, and on which I need not dwell. You don't like to dwell on those sort of things, do you, Pew? I knew really nothing about the pipe. As was the case with Pew, one peculiarity I learned from actual experience. It was also from actual experience that I learned that the thing was, well, I said haunted, but you may use any other word you like. Tell us, as briefly as possible, what it was you really did discover. Take the pipe out of the box. Brasher took the pipe out of the box and held it in his hand. You see that creature on it? Well, when I first had it, it was underneath the pipe. How do you mean that it was underneath the pipe? It was bunched together underneath the stem, just at the end of the mouthpiece, in the same way in which a fly might be suspended from the ceiling. When I began to smoke the pipe, I saw the creature move. But I thought that unconsciousness immediately followed. It did follow, but not before I saw that the thing was moving. It was because I thought that I had been, in a way, a victim of delirium that I tried the second smoke. Suspecting that the thing was drugged, I swallowed what I believed would prove a powerful antidote. It enabled me to resist the influence of the narcotic much longer than before, and while I still retained my senses, I saw the creature crawl along the stem and over the bowl. It was that sight, I believe, as much as anything else, which sent me silly. When I came to, I then and there decided to present the pipe to Pew. There is one more thing I would remark. When the pipe left me, the creature's legs were twined about the bowl. Now they are withdrawn. Possibly you, Pew, are able to cap my little story with a little one which is all your own. I certainly did imagine that I saw the creature move, but I suppose that while I was under the influence of the drug, imagination had played me a trick. Not a bit of it. Depend upon it, the beast is bewitched. Even to my eye it looks as though it were, and to a trained eye like yours, Pew, you've been looking for the devil a long time, and you've got him at last. I wish you wouldn't make those remarks, Tress. They jar on me. I confess, interpolated Brasher. I noticed that he had put the pipe down on the table, as though he were tired of holding it, that, to my thinking, such remarks are not appropriate. At the same time, what you have told us is, I am bound to allow, a little curious. But of course what I require is ocular demonstration. I haven't seen the movement myself. No, what you very soon will do if you care to have a pull at the pipe on your own account. Do, Brasher, to oblige me, there's a dear. It appears, then, that the movement is only observable when the pipe is smoked. We have at least arrived at step number 1. Here's a match, Brasher. Light it up and we shall have arrived at step number 2. Tress lit a match and held it out to Brasher. Brasher retreated from its neighborhood. Thank you, Mr. Tress. I am no smoker, as you are aware, and I have no desire to acquire the art of smoking by means of a poisoned pipe. Tress laughed. He blew out the match and threw it into the grate. Then I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll have a Bob. Bob? Why Bob? Bob, whose real name was Robert Haynes, though I should think he must have forgotten the fact, so seldom was he addressed by it, was Tress's servant. He had been an old soldier and had accompanied his master when he left the service. He was as depraved a character as Tress himself. I am not sure even that he was not worse than his master. I shall never forget how he once behaved toward myself. He actually had the assurance to accuse me of attempting to steal the Wardour Street relic which Tress fondly deludes himself was once the property of Sir Walter Raleigh. The truth is that I had slipped it with my handkerchief into my pocket in a fit of absence of mind. A man who could accuse me of such a thing would be guilty of anything. I was therefore quite at one with Brasher when he explained what Bob could possibly be wanted for. Tress explained. "I'll get him to smoke the pipe," he said. Brasher and I exchanged glances, but we refrained from speech. "It won't do him any harm," said Tress. "What? Not a poisoned pipe?" asked Brasher. "It's not poisoned. It's only drugged." "Only drugged?" "Nothing hurts Bob. He is like an ostrich. He has digestive organs which are peculiarly his own. It will only serve him as it served me, and Pew. It will knock him over. It is all done in the pursuit of truth and for the advancement of inquiry." I could see that Brasher did not altogether like the tone in which Tress repeated his words. As for me, it was not to be supposed that I should put myself out in a matter which in no way concerned me. If Tress chose to poison the man, it was his affair, not mine. He went to the door and shouted, "Bob, come here, you scoundrel!" That is the way in which he speaks to him. No really decent servant would stand it. I shouldn't care to address Nalder, my servant, in such a way. He would give me notice on the spot. Bob came in. He is a great hulking fellow who is always on the grin. Tress had a decanter of brandy in his hand. He filled a tumbler with a neat spirit. "Bob, what would you say to a glassful of brandy? The real thing, my boy." "Thank you, sir." "And what would you say to a pull at a pipe when the brandy is drunk?" "A pipe?" The fellow is sharp enough when he likes. I saw him look at the pipe upon the table, and then at us, and then a gleam of intelligence came into his eyes. "I'd do it for $1, sir." $1, you thief?" "I meant 10 shillings, sir." 10 shillings, you brazen vagabond?" "I should have said £1." "A pound? Was ever the like of that? Do I understand you to ask £1 for taking a pull at your master's pipe?" "I'm thinking that I'll have to make it 2. "The deuce you are! Here, Pew, lend me £1. "I'm afraid I've left my purse behind." "Then lend me 10 shillings. Ananias, I doubt if I have more than 5. "Then give me the 5, and Brasher, lend me the other 15. Brasher lent him the 15. I doubt if we shall either of us ever see our money again. He handed the £1 to Bob. "Here's the brandy. Drink it up." Bob drank it without a word, draining the glass of every drop. "And here's the pipe." "Is it poisoned, sir?" "Poisoned, you villain! What do you mean?" "It isn't the first time I've seen your tricks, sir. Is it now? And you're not the one to give £1 for nothing at all. If it kills me, you'll send my body to my mother. She'd like to know I was dead." "Send your body to your grandmother. You idiot, sit down and smoke." Bob sat down. Tress had filled the pipe and handed it with the lighted match to Bob. The fellow declined the match. He handled the pipe very gingerly, turning it over and over, eyeing it with his eyes. "Thank you, sir. I'll light it up myself if it's the same to you. I carry matches of my own. It's a beautiful pipe entirely. I never see the likes of it for ugliness. And what's this slimy-looking varmint that looks as though it would like to have my life? Is it living or is it dead? Come, we don't want to sit here all day, my man. Well, sir, the look of this here pipe has quite upset my stomach. I'd like another drop of liquor if it's the same to you." "Another drop? Why, you've had a tumbler full already. Here's another tumbler full to put on top of that. You won't want the pipe to kill you. You'll be killed before you get to it." And isn't it better to die a natural death? Bob emptied the second tumbler of brandy as though it were water. I believe he would empty a hogshead without turning a hair. Then he gave another look at the pipe. Then, taking a match from his waistcoat pocket, he drew a long breath, as though he were resigning himself to fate. Striking the match on the seat of his trousers, while, shaded by his hand, the flame was gathering strength, he looked at each of us in turn. When he looked at Tress, I distinctly saw him wink his eye. What my feelings would have been if a servant of mine had winked his eye at me, I am unable to imagine. The match was applied to the tobacco. A puff of smoke came through his lips. The pipe was alight. During this process of lighting the pipe we had sat, I do not wish to use exaggerated language, but we had sat and watched that alcoholic scamp's proceedings as though we were witnessing an action which would leave its mark upon the age. When we saw the pipe was lighted, we gave a simultaneous start. Brasher put his hands under his coat tails and gave a kind of hop. I raised myself a good 6 inches from my chair, and Tress rubbed his palms together with a chuckle. Bob alone was calm. "Now," cried Tress, "you'll see the devil moving." Bob took the pipe from between his lips. "See what?" he said. "Bob, you rascal, put that pipe back into your mouth and smoke it for your life." Bob was eyeing the pipe askance. "I dare say, but what I want to know is whether this here varmint's dead or whether he isn't. I don't want to have him flying at my nose, and he looks vicious enough for anything." "Give me back that pound, you thief, and get out of my house and bundle." "I ain't gonna give you back no pound." "Then smoke that pipe." "I am smoking it, ain't I?" With the utmost deliberation, Bob returned the pipe to his mouth. He emitted another whiff or two of smoke. "Now, now," cried Tress, all excitement, and wagging his hand in the air. We gathered round. As we did so, Bob again withdrew the pipe. "What is the meaning of all this here? I ain't going to have you playing none of your larks on me. I know there's something up, but I ain't going to throw my life away for 20 shillings. Not quite, I ain't." Tress, whose temper is not at any time one of the best, was seized with quite a spasm of rage. "As I live, my lad, if you try to cheat me by taking that pipe from between your lips until I tell you, you leave this room that instant, never again to be a servant of mine." I presume the fellow knew from long experience when his master meant what he said, and when he didn't. Without an attempt at remonstrance, he replaced the pipe. He continued stolidly to puff away. Tress caught me by the arm. "What did I tell you? There, that tentacle is moving." The uplifted tentacle was moving. It was doing what I had seen it do, as I supposed in my distorted imagination. It was reaching forward. Undoubtedly, Bob saw what it was doing, but whether in obedience to his master's commands, or whether because the drug was already beginning to take effect, he made no movement to withdraw the pipe. He watched the slowly advancing tentacle, coming closer and closer toward his nose, with an expression of such intense horror on his countenance that it became quite shocking. Farther and farther the creature reached forward, until, on a sudden, with a sort of jerk, the movement assumed a downward direction, and the tentacle was slowly lowered until the tip rested on the stem of the pipe. For a moment the creature remained motionless. I was quieting my nerves with the reflection that this thing was but some trick of the carver's art, and that what we had seen in a sort of nightmare, when the whole hideous reptile was seized with what seemed to be a fit of convulsive shuddering. It seemed to be in agony. It trembled so violently that I expected to see it loosen its hold of the stem and fall to the ground. I was sufficiently master of myself to steal a glance at Bob. We had had an inkling of what might happen. He was wholly unprepared. As he saw that dreadful, human-looking creature coming to life, as it seemed, within an inch or two of his nose, his eyes dilated to twice their usual size. I hoped, for his sake, that unconsciousness would supervene through the action of the drug, before through sheer fright his senses left him. Perhaps mechanically he puffed steadily on. The creature's shuddering became more violent. It appeared to swell before our eyes. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the shuddering ceased. There was another instant of questions. Then the creature began to crawl along the stem of the pipe. It moved with marvelous caution, the merest fraction of an inch at a time. But still it moved. Our eyes were riveted on it with a fascination which was absolutely nauseous. I am unpleasantly affected even as I think of it now. My dreams of the night before had been nothing to this. Slowly it went, nearer and nearer to the smoker's nose. Its mode of progression was in the highest degree unsightly. It glided, never, so far as I could see, removing its tentacles from the stem of the pipe. It slipped its hindmost feelers onward until they came up to those which were in advance. Then, in their turn, it advanced those which were in front. It seemed, too, to move with the utmost labor, shuddering as though it were in pain. We were all, for our parts, speechless. I was momentarily hoping that the drug would take effect on Bob. Either his constitution enabled him to offer a strong resistance to narcotics, or else the large quantity of neat spirit which he had drunk acted, as Tress had malevolently intended that it should, as an antidote. It seemed to me that he would never succumb. On went the creature, on and on, in its infinitesimal progression. I was spellbound. I would have given the world to scream, to have been able to utter a sound. I could do nothing else but watch. The creature had reached the end of the stem. It had gained the amber mouthpiece. It was within an inch of the smoker's nose. Still, on it went. It seemed to move with greater freedom on the amber. It increased its rate of progress. It was actually touching the foremost feature of the smoker's countenance. I expected to see it grip the wretched bod, when it began to oscillate from side to side. Its oscillations increased in violence. It fell to the floor. That same instant the narcotic prevailed. Bob slipped sideways from the chair, the pipe still held tightly between his rigid jaws. We were silent. There lay Bob. Close beside him lay the creature. A few more inches to the left, and he would have fallen on and squashed it flat. It had fallen on its back. Its feelers were extended upward. They were writhing and twisting and turning in the air. Tress was the first to speak. "I think a little brandy won't be amiss." Emptying the remainder of the brandy into a glass, he swallowed it at a draught. Now for a closer examination of our friend. Taking a pair of tongs from the grate, he nipped the creature between them. He deposited it upon the table. I rather fancy that this is a case for dissection. He took a penknife from his waistcoat pocket. Opening the large blade, he thrust its point into the object on the table. Little or no resistance seemed to be offered to the passage of the blade, but as it was inserted, the tentacula simultaneously began to writhe and twist. Tress withdrew the knife. "I thought so." He held the blade out for our inspection. The point was covered with some viscid-looking matter. "That's blood. The thing's alive." "Alive. Alive. That's the secret of the whole performance." But me no buts, my pew. The mystery's exploded. One more ghost is lost to the world. The person from whom I obtained that pipe was an Indian juggler, up to many tricks of the trade. He, or someone for him, got hold of this sweet thing in reptiles, and a sweeter thing would, I imagine, be hard to find, and covered it with some preparation of possibly gum arabic. He allowed this to harden. Then he stuck the thing, still living, for those sort of gentry are hard to kill, to the pipe. The consequence was that when anyone lit up, the warmth was communicated to the adhesive agent. Again, some preparation of gum, no doubt. It moistened it, and the creature, with infinite difficulty, was able to move. But I am open to lay odds with any gentleman of sporting tastes that this time the creature's traveling days are done. It has given me rather a larger taste of the horrors than is good for my digestion. With the aid of the tongs, he removed the creature from the table. He placed it on the hearth. Before Brasher or I had any notion of what it was he intended to do, he covered it with a heavy marble paperweight. Then he stood upon the weight, and between the marble and the hearth he ground the creature flat. While the execution was still proceeding, Bob sat up upon the floor. "Hello," he asked. "What's happened?" "We've emptied the bottle, Bob," said Tress. "But there's another where that came from. Perhaps you could drink another tumblerful, my boy?" Bob drank it. Footnote. These gentry are hard to kill. Here is fact, not fantasy. Lizard yarns no less sensational than this mystery story can be found between the covers of solemn zoological textbooks. Reptiles, indeed, are far from finicky in the matters of air, space, and especially warmth. Frogs and other such sluggish-blooded creatures have lived after being frozen fast in ice. Their blood is little warmer than air or water, enjoying no extra casing of fur or feathers. Air and food seem held in light esteem by lizards. Their blood need not be highly oxygenated. It nourishes just as well when impure. In temperate climes, lizards lie torpid and buried all winter. Some species of the tropic deserts sleep peacefully all summer. Their anatomy includes no means for the continuous introduction and expulsion of air. Reptilian lungs are little more than closed sacs without cell structure. If any further zoological fact were needed to verify the denouement of the pipe, it might be the general statement that lizards are abnormal brutes anyhow. Consider the chameleons of unsettled hue, and what is one to think of an animal which, when captured by the tail, is able to make its escape by willfully shuffling off that appendage? Editor. End of section 16. Recording by Drew Piston. www.drewpiston.com.
Section 17 of Library of the World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Library of the World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 3, by Julian Hawthorne, Editor. Section 17. The Puzzle, Anonymous. Pooh came into my room holding something wrapped in a piece of brown paper. "Tress, I have brought you something on which you may exercise your ingenuity." He began, with exasperating deliberation, to untie the string which bound his parcel. He is one of those persons who would not cut a knot to save their lives. The process occupied him the better part of a quarter of an hour. Then he held out the contents of the paper. "What do you think of that?" he asked. I thought nothing of it, and I told him so. I was prepared for that confession. "I have noticed, Tress, that you generally do think nothing of an article which really deserves the attention of a truly thoughtful mind. Possibly, as you think so little of it, you will be able to solve the puzzle." I took what he held out to me. It was an oblong box, perhaps 7 inches long by 3 inches broad. "Where's the puzzle?" I asked. "If you will examine the lid of the box, you will see." I turned it over and over. It was difficult to see which was the lid. Then I perceived that on one side were printed these words: "Puzzle, to open the box." These words were so faintly printed that it was not surprising that I had not noticed them at first. Pugh explained. "I observed that box on a tray outside a second-hand furniture shop. It struck my eye. I took it up. I examined it. I inquired of the proprietor of the shop in what the puzzle lay. He replied that was more than he could tell me. He himself had made several attempts to open the box, and all of them had failed. I purchased it. I took it home. I have tried, and I have failed. I am aware, Tress, of how you pride yourself upon your ingenuity. I cannot doubt that, if you try, you will not fail." While Pugh was proposing, I was examining the box. It was at least well made. It weighed certainly under 2 ounces. I struck it with my knuckles. It sounded hollow. There was no hinge, nothing of any kind to show that it had ever been opened, or, for that matter, that it could be opened. The more I examined the thing, the more it whetted my curiosity. That it could be opened, and in some ingenious manner, I made no doubt, but how? The box was not a new one. At a rough guess, I should say that it had been a box for a good half-century. There were certain signs of age about it which could not escape the practised eye. Had it remained unopened all that time? When opened, what would be found inside? It sounded hollow. Probably nothing at all. Who could tell? It was formed of small pieces of inlaid wood. Several woods had been used. Some of them were strange to me. They were of different colors. It was pretty obvious they all must have been hardwood. The pieces were of various shapes, hexagonal, octagonal, triangular, square, oblong, and even circular. The process of inlaying them had been beautifully done. So nicely had the parts been joined that the lines of meeting were difficult to discover with the naked eye. They had been joined solid, so to speak. It was an excellent example of marquetry. I had been over-hasty in my deprecation. I owed as much to Pugh. This box of yours is better worth looking at than I first supposed. Is it to be sold? No, it is not to be sold, nor, he fixed me with his spectacles, is it to be given away. I have brought it to you for the simple purpose of ascertaining if you have the ingenuity enough to open it. I will engage to open it in 2 seconds, with a hammer. I dare say I will open it with a hammer. The thing is to open without it. Let me see, I began, with the aid of a microscope, to examine the box more closely. I will give you one piece of information, Pugh. Unless I am mistaken, the secret lies in one of these little pieces of inlaid wood. You push it, or you press it, or something, and the whole affair flies open. Such was my own first conviction. I am not so sure of it now. I have pressed every separate piece of wood. I have tried to move each piece in every direction. No result has followed. My theory was a hidden spring. But there must be a hidden spring of some sort, unless you are to open it by mere exercise of force. I suppose the box is empty. I thought it was at first, but now I'm not so sure of that either. It all depends on the position in which you hold it. Hold it in this position, like this, close to your ear. Have you a small hammer? I took a small hammer. Tap it softly, with the hammer. Don't you notice a sort of reverberation within? Pugh was right. There certainly was something within. Something which seemed to echo back my tapping, almost as if it were a living thing. I mentioned this to Pugh. But you don't think that there is something alive inside the box? There can't be. The box must be airtight, probably as much as airtight as an exhausted receiver. How do we know that? How can we tell that no minute interstice must have been left for the express purposes of ventilation? I continued tapping with the hammer. I noticed one peculiarity, that it was only when I held the box in a particular position and tapped at a certain spot, there came the answering taps from within. I tell you what it is, Pugh. What I hear is the reverberation of some machinery. Do you think so? I'm sure of it. Give the box to me. Pugh put the box to his ear. He tapped. It sounds to me like an echoing tick of some great beetle, like the noise which a death watch makes, you know. Trust Pugh to find a remarkable explanation for a simple fact. If the explanation leans towards the supernatural, so much the more satisfactory to Pugh. I knew better. The sound which you hear is merely the throbbing or the trembling of the mechanism with which it is intended that the box should open. The mechanism is placed just where you are tapping it with the hammer. Every tap causes it to jar. It sounds to me like the ticking of a death watch. However, on such subjects, Tress, I know what you are. My dear Pugh, give it an extra hard tap and you will see. He gave it an extra hard tap. The moment he had done so, he started. I've done it now. What have you done? Broken something, I fancy. He listened intensely with his ear to the box. No, it seems all right. And yet I could have sworn I'd damaged something. I heard it smash. Give me the box. He gave it to me. In my turn, I listened. I shook the box. Pugh must have been mistaken. Nothing rattled. There was not a sound. The box was as empty as before. I gave a smart tap with the hammer as Pugh had done. Then there certainly was a curious sound. To my ear, it sounded like the smashing of glass. I wonder if there's anything fragile inside your precious puzzle, Pugh, and if so, if we are shivering it by degrees. What is that noise? I lay in bed in a curious condition which is in between sleep and waking. When at last I knew I was awake, I asked myself what it was that had woke me. Suddenly, I became conscious that something was making itself audible in the silence of the night. For some seconds I lay and listened. Then I sat up in bed. What is that noise? It was like the tick-tick of some large and unusually clear-toned clock. It might have been a clock, had it not been that the sound was varied, every half-dozen ticks or so, by a sort of stifled screech, such as might have been uttered by a small creature in an extremity of an anguish. I got out of bed. It was ridiculous to think of sleep during the continuation of that uncanny shrieking. I struck a light. The sound seemed to come from the neighborhood of my dressing table. I went to the dressing table, the lighted match in my hand, and as I did so my eyes fell on Pugh's mysterious box. The same instant there issued from the bowels of the box a more uncomfortable shriek than I had heard previously. It took me so completely by surprise that I let the match fall from my hand to the floor. The room was in darkness. I stood, I will not say trembling, listening, considering their volume, to the eeriest shrieks I'd ever heard. All at once they ceased. Then came the tick, tick, tick again. I struck another match and lit the gas. Pugh had left his puzzle box behind him. We had done all we could together to solve the puzzle. He had left it behind to see what I could do with it alone. So much had it engrossed my attention that I even brought it into my bedroom in order that I might, before retiring to rest, make a final attempt at the solution of the mystery. Now what possessed the thing? As I stood and looked and listened, one thing began to be clear to me, that some sort of machinery had been set to motion inside the box. How had it been set in motion was another matter. But the box had been subjected to so much handling, to such pressing and such hammering, that it was not strange if, after all, Pugh or I had unconsciously hit upon the spring which set the whole thing going. Possibly the mechanism had gotten so rusty that it refuses to act all at once. It had hung fire, and only after some hours had something or other set the imprisoned motive power free. But what about the screeching? Could there be some living creature concealed within the box? Was I listening to the cries of some small animal in agony? Momentary reflection suggested that the explanation of the one thing was the explanation of the other. Rust. There was the mystery. The same rust which had prevented the mechanism from acting at once was causing the screeching now. The uncanny sounds were caused by nothing more nor less than the want of a drop or two of oil. Such an explanation would not have satisfied Pugh. It satisfied me. Picking up the box, I placed it to my ear. I wonder how long this little performance is going to continue, and what is going to happen when it is good enough to cease. I hope, an uncomfortable thought occurred to me, I hope Pugh hasn't picked up some pleasant little novelty in the way of an infernal machine. It would be a first-rate joke if he and I had been endeavoring to solve the puzzle of how to set it going. I don't mind owning that as this reflection crossed my mind I placed Pugh's puzzle on the dressing table. The idea did not commend itself to me at all. The box evidently contained some curious mechanism. It might be more curious than comfortable. Possibly some agreeable little device in clockwork. The tick-tick-tick suggested clockwork which had been planned to go a certain time and then for all I knew, ignite an explosive and blow up. It would be a charming solution to the puzzle if it were to explode while I stood there in my nightshirt looking on. It is true the box weighed very little. Probably, if I had said, the whole affair would not have turned the scale at a couple of ounces. But then, its very lightness might have been part of the ingenious inventor's game. There are explosives with which one can work very satisfactorily amount of damage with considerably less than a couple of ounces. While I was hesitating, I own it, whether I had not better immerse Pugh's puzzle in a can of water or throw it out the window, or call down Bob with a request to at once remove it to his apartment, both the tick-tick-tick and the screeching ceased, and all within the box was still. If it was going to explode, it was now or never. Instinctively, I moved in the direction of the door. I waited with a certain sense of anxiety. I waited in vain. Nothing happened. Not even a renewal of sound. I wish Pugh had kept his precious puzzle at home. This sort of thing tries one's nerves. When I thought that I perceived that nothing seemed likely to happen, I returned to the neighborhood of the table. I looked at the box askance. I took it up gingerly. Something might go off at any moment for all I knew. It would be too much of a joke if Pugh's precious puzzle exploded in my hand. I shook it doubtfully. Nothing rattled. I held it to my ear. There was not a sound. What had taken place? Had the clockwork run down? and was the machine arranged with such a diabolical ingenuity that a certain interval was required after the clockwork had run down before an explosion would occur? Or had rust caused the mechanism again to hang fire? After making all that commotion, the thing might at least come open. I banged the box viciously against the corner of the table. I felt that I would almost rather that an explosion should take place than that nothing should occur. One does not care to be disturbed from one's sound slumber in the small hours of the morning for a trifle. I've half a mind to get a hammer and try, as they say in the cookery books, another way. Unfortunately, I had promised Pugh to abstain from using force. I might have shivered the box open with my hammer and then explained that it had fallen, or got trod upon, or sat upon, or something, or so got shattered, only I was afraid that Pugh would not believe me. The man is himself such an untruthful man that he is in a chronic state of suspicion about the truthfulness of others. Well, if you're not going to blow up or open or something, I'll say good night. I gave the box a final rap with my knuckles and a final shake, replaced it on the table, put out the gas, and returned to bed. I was just sinking again into slumber when that box began again. It was true that Pugh had purchased the puzzle, but it was evident that the whole enjoyment of the purchase was destined to be mine. It was useless to think of sleep while that performance was going on. I sat up in bed once more. It strikes me that the puzzle consists in finding out how it is possible to go to sleep with Pugh's purchase in your bedroom. This is far better than the old-fashioned prescription of cats on the tiles. It struck me that the noise was distinctly louder than before. This applied both to the tick, tick, tick and the screeching. Possibly, I told myself as I relighted the gas, the explosion is going to come off this time. I turned to look at the box. There could be no doubt about it, the noise was louder. And if I could trust my eyes, the box was moving, giving a series of little jumps. This might have been an optical delusion, but it seemed to me that each tick gave the box a bound. During the screeches, which sounded more like the cries of an animal in agony of pain even than before, if it did not tilt itself first on one end and then on the other, I shall never be willing to trust the evidence of my own eyes again. And surely the box had increased in size. I could have sworn not only had it increased, but that it was increasing even as I stood there looking on. It had grown, and was still growing, both broader and longer and deeper. Pugh, of course, would have attributed it to a supernatural agency. There never was a man with such a nose for a ghost. I could picture him occupying my position, shivering in his nightshirt, as he beheld that miracle taking place before his eyes. The solution, which at once suggested itself to me, and which would never have suggested itself to Pugh, was that the box was fashioned as if it were, in layers, and that the ingenious mechanism it contained was forcing the sides at once both upward and outward. I took it in my hand. I could feel something striking against the bottom of the box, like a tap-tap-tapping of a tiny hammer. This is a pretty puzzle of Pugh's. He would say that this is the tapping of a death watch. For my part, I have not much faith in death watches, et hoc genus omne, but it is certainly a curious tapping. I wonder what is going to happen next. Apparently nothing, except a continuation of those mysterious sounds. That the box had increased in size I had, and have, no doubt whatsoever. I should say that it had increased a good inch in every direction, at least half an inch while I had been looking on. But while I stood, looking, its growth was suddenly and perceptibly stayed. It ceased to move. Only the noise continued. I wonder how long it'll be before anything worth happening does happen. I suppose something is going to happen. This can't be all this to do for nothing. If it is anything in the infernal machine line, and there is going to be an explosion, I might as well be here to see it. I think I'll have a pipe. I put on my dressing gown. I lit my pipe. I sat and stared at the box. I dare say I sat there for quite 20 minutes when, as before, without any sort of warning, the sound was stilled. Its sudden cessation rather startled me. Has the mechanism again hung fire? Or this time is the explosion coming off? It did not come off. Nothing came off. Isn't the box even going to open? It did not open. There was simply silence all at once, and that was all. I sat there in expectation for some moments longer, but I sat for nothing. I rose. I took the box in my hand, and I shook it. This puzzle is a puzzle. I held the box first to one ear, then the other. I gave it several sharp raps with my knuckles. There was not an answering sound, not even the sort of reverberation which Pugh and I had noticed at first. It seemed hollower than ever. It was as though the soul of the box was dead. I suppose if I put you down and extinguish the gas and return to bed, in about half an hour or so, just as I'm dropping off to sleep, the performance will be recommenced. Perhaps the third time will be lucky. But I was mistaken. There was no third time. When I returned to bed that time, I returned to sleep, and I was allowed to sleep. There was no continuation of the performance, at least so far as I know. For no sooner was I once more between the sheets than I was seized with an irresistible drowsiness, a drowsiness which so mastered me that I imagine it must have been instantly, sank into a slumber which lasted till long after the day had dawned. Whether or not any more mysterious sounds issued from the bowels of Pugh's puzzle is more than I can tell. If they did not succeed in rousing me. And yet, when at last I did awake, I had a sort of consciousness that my waking had been caused by something strange. What it was I could not surmise. My own impression was that I had been awakened by the touch of a person's hand, but that impression must have been a mistaken one, because, as I could easily see by looking round the room, there was no one in the room to touch me. It was broad daylight. I looked at my watch. It was nearly 11 o'clock. I am a pretty late sleeper as a rule, but I do not usually sleep as late as that. That scoundrel Bob would let me sleep all day without thinking it necessary to call me. I was just about to spring out of bed with the intention of ringing the bell so that I might give Bob a piece of my mind for allowing me to sleep so late, when my glance fell on the dressing table on which the night before I had placed Pugh's puzzle. It had gone. Its absence so took me by surprise that I ran to the table. It had gone, but it had not gone far. It had gone to pieces. There were pieces lying where the box had been. The puzzle had solved itself. The box was open with a vengeance, one might say. Like that unfortunate Humpty Dumpty who, so the chroniclers tell us, sat on a wall, surely all the king's horses and all the king's men never could put Pugh's puzzle together again. The marquetry had resolved itself into its component parts. How those parts had ever joined was a mystery. They had laid upon no foundation, as is the case with ordinary inlaid work. The several pieces of wood were not only of different shapes and sizes, but they were as thin as the thinnest veneer, yet the box had been formed by simply joining them together. The man who made that box must have been possessed of ingenuity worthy of a better cause. I perceived how the puzzle had been worked. The box had contained an arrangement of springs which, on being released, had expanded themselves in different directions until their mere expansion had rent the box to pieces. There were the springs lying amid the ruin they had caused. There was something else amid the ruin besides those springs. There was a small piece of writing paper. I took it up. On the reverse side of it was written in a minute, crabbed hand, "A present for you." What was a present for me? I looked, and, not for the first time since I had caught sight of Pugh's precious puzzle, could scarcely believe my eyes. There, poised between two upright wires, the bent ends of which held it aloft in the air, was either a piece of glass or a crystal. The scrap of writing paper had exactly covered it. I understood what it was when Pugh and I had tapped with a hammer, had caused the answering taps to proceed from within. Our tap caused the wires to oscillate, and in these oscillations the crystal, which they had held suspended, had touched the side of the box. I looked again at the piece of paper. "A present for you." Was this the present, this crystal? I regarded it intently. It can't be a diamond. The idea was ridiculous, absurd. No man in his senses would place a diamond inside a two-penny, half-penny puzzle box. The thing was as big as a walnut. And yet, I am a pretty good judge of precious stones. If it was not an uncut diamond, it was the best imitation I had seen. I took it up. I examined it closely. The more closely I examined it, the more my wonder grew. It is a diamond. And yet, the idea was too preposterous for credence. Who would present a diamond as big as a walnut with a trumpery puzzle? Besides, all the diamonds which the world contains of that size are almost as well known as the Koh-i-Noor. If it is a diamond, it is worth, heaven only knows what it isn't worth if it is a diamond. I regarded it through a strong pocket lens. As I did so, I could not restrain an exclamation. The world to a China orange, it is a diamond. The words had scarcely escaped my lips than there came a tapping at the door. Come in, I cried, supposing it was Bob. It was not Bob, it was Pugh. Instinctively, I put the lens and the crystal behind my back. The sight of me in my nightshirt, Pugh began to shake his head. What hours, Tress, what hours? Why, my dear Tress, I've breakfasted, read the paper and my letters, came all the way from my house here, and you're not up? Don't I look as though I were up? Ah, Tress, Tress. He approached the dressing table. His eye fell upon the ruins. What's this? That's the solution to the puzzle. Have you solved it fairly, Tress? It has solved itself. Our handling and tapping and hammering must have freed the springs which the box contained, and during the night while I slept, they have caused it to come open. While you slept? Dear me, how strange. And what are these? He had discovered the two upright wires on which the crystal had been poised. I suppose they're part of the puzzle. And was there anything in the box? What's this? He picked up the scrap of paper. I had left it on the table. He read what was written on it. A present for you. What's it mean? Tress, was this in the box? It was. What's it mean about a present? Was there anything in the box besides? Pugh, if you will leave the room, I shall be able to dress. I'm not in the habit of receiving quite such early calls, or I should have been prepared to receive you. If you will wait in the next room, I will be with you as soon as I'm dressed. There is a little subject in connection with the box which I wish to discuss with you. A subject in connection with the box? What is the subject? I will tell you, Pugh, when I have performed my toilet. Why can't you tell me now? Do you propose that, then, I should stand here shivering in my shirt while you are prosing at your ease? Thank you, I'm obliged, but I decline. May I ask you once more, Pugh, to wait for me in the adjoining apartment? He moved towards the door. When he had taken a couple of steps, he halted. I hope, Tress, that you're going to play no tricks on me? Tricks on you? Is it likely I'm going to play tricks on my oldest friend? When he had gone, he vanished, it seemed to me, with a somewhat doubtful visage. I took the crystal to the window, and I drew the blind. I let the sunshine fall on it. I examined it again, closely and minutely, with the aid of my pocket lens. It was a diamond. There could not be any doubt of it. If, with my knowledge of stones, I was deceived, then I was deceived as never a man had been deceived before. My heart beat faster as I recognized the fact that I was holding in my hand what was, in all probability, a fortune for a man of moderate desires. Of course, Pugh knew nothing of what I had discovered, and there was no reason why he should know. Not the least. The only difficulty was that if I kept my own counsel and sold the stone, and utilized the proceeds of the sale, I should have to invent a story which would account for my sudden accession to fortune. Pugh knows almost as much of my affairs as I do of myself. That's the worst of these old friends. When I joined Pugh, I found him dancing up and down on the floor like a bear upon hot plates. He scarcely allowed me to put my nose inside the door before attacking me. Tress, give me what was in the box. My dear Pugh, how do you know there was something in the box to give you? I know there was. Indeed, if you know there was something in the box, perhaps you will tell me what that something was. He eyed me doubtfully. Then advancing, he laid upon my arm a hand which positively trembled. Tress, you wouldn't play tricks on an old friend. You're right, Pugh, I wouldn't, though I believe there have been occasions on which you have had doubts upon the subject. By the way, Pugh, I believe I am the oldest friend that you have. I don't know about that. There's Brasher. Brasher? Who's Brasher? You wouldn't compare my friendship to the friendship of such a man as Brasher. Think of the tastes we have in common, you and I. We're both collectors. Yes, we're both collectors. I make my interests yours, and you make your interests mine. Isn't that true, Pugh? Tress, what was in the box? I'll be frank with you, Pugh. If there had been something in the box, would you have been willing to go halves with me in your discovery? Go halves? In your discovery, Tress? Give me what was mine. With pleasure, Pugh, if you will tell me what is yours. If you don't give me what was in the box, I'll send for the police. Do. Then I'll be able to hand them what was in the box in order that it may be restored to its proper owner. Its proper owner? I'm its proper owner. Excuse me, But I don't understand how that can be, at least until the police have made inquiries. I should say that the proper owner was the person from whom you purchased the box, or more probably, the person from whom he purchased it, and by whom, doubtless, it was sold in ignorance or by mistake. Thus, Pugh, if you will only send for the police, we shall earn the gratitude of a person of whom we've never heard of in our lives, I for discovering the contents of the box, and you for returning them." As I said this, Pugh's face was a study. He gasped for breath. He actually took out his handkerchief to wipe his brow. "Tress, I don't think you need to use a tone like that with me. It isn't friendly. What was in the box? Let us understand each other, Pugh. If you don't hand over what was in the box to the police, I go halves." Pugh began to dance on the floor. "What a fool I was to trust you with the box. I knew I couldn't trust you." I said nothing. I turned and rang the bell. "What's that for?" "That, my dear Pugh, is for breakfast, and if you desire it, for the police. You know, although you have breakfasted, I haven't. Perhaps while I'm breaking my fast, you would like to summon the representatives of law and order." Bob came in. I ordered breakfast, and then I turned to Pugh. "Is there anything else you'd like?" "No, I've breakfasted. It wasn't of breakfast I was thinking. It was of something else. Bob is at your service if, for instance, you wish to send him on an errand." "No, I want nothing. Bob can go." Bob went. Directly he was gone and Pugh turned to me. "You shall have half. What was in the box?" "I shall have half?" "You shall." "I don't think it's necessary that the terms of our little understanding should be expressly embodied in black and white. I fancy that, under the circumstances, I can trust you, Pugh. I believe that I am capable of seeing that in this matter you don't do me. That was in the box." I held out the crystal between my finger and thumb. "What is it?" "That is what I desire to learn." "Let me look at it." "You're welcome to look at it where it is. Look at it as long as you like and as closely." Pugh leaned over my hand. His eyes began to gleam. He is himself not a bad judge of precious stones, is Pugh. It's Tress, it's a diamond." "That question I've already asked myself." "Let me look at it. It'll be safe with me. It's mine." I immediately put the thing behind my back. "Pardon me, it belongs to neither you or me. It belongs, in all probability, to the person who sold that puzzle to the man from whom you bought it. Perhaps some weeping widow, Pugh, or hopeless orphan. Think of it. Let us have no further misunderstanding upon that point, my dear old friend. Still, because you are my dear old friend, I'm willing to trust you with this discovery of mine on condition that you don't attempt to remove it from my sight, and that you return it to me the moment I require you. You're very hard on me." I made a movement towards my waistcoat pocket. "I'll return it to you." I handed him the crystal, and with it I handed him my pocket lens. "With the aid of that glass, I imagine that you will be able to subject it to more acute examination, Pugh." He began to examine it through the lens. Directly he did so, he gave an exclamation. In a few moments he looked up at me. His eyes were glistening behind his spectacles. I could see he trembled. "Tress, it's a diamond, a Brazil diamond. It's worth a fortune." "I'm glad you think so." "Glad I think so? Don't you think it's a diamond?" "It appears to be a diamond. Under ordinary conditions, I should say without hesitation that it was a diamond. But when I consider the circumstances of its discovery, I'm driven to doubts." "How much did you give for that puzzle, Pugh?" "9 pence. The fellow wanted a shilling, but I gave him 9 pence. He seemed content. 9 pence. Does it seem reasonable that we should find a diamond which, if it is a diamond, is the finest stone I ever saw and handled in a 9-penny puzzle? It is not as though it ever got into the thing by accident. It had evidently been placed there to be found, and apparently by anyone who chanced to solve the puzzle. Witness the writing on the scrap of paper." Pugh re-examined the crystal. "It is a diamond. I'll stake my life that it's a diamond. Still, though it be a diamond, I smell a rat." "What do you mean?" "I strongly suspect that the person who placed that diamond inside the puzzle intended to have a joke at the expense of the person who discovered it. What was to be the nature of the joke is more than I can say at present, but I should like to have a bet with you that the man who compounded that puzzle was an ingenious practical joker. I may be wrong, Pugh, we shall see. But until I have proved to the contrary, I don't believe that the maddest man ever lived would throw away a diamond worth, apparently, shall we say, £1,000? £1,000! This diamond is worth a good deal more than £1,000. Well, that only makes my case stronger. I don't believe that the maddest man that ever lived would throw away a diamond worth more than £1,000, with such utter wantonness as seemed to have characterized in the action of the original owner of the stone, which I found in your ninepenny puzzle, Pugh. There have been some eccentric characters in the world, some very eccentric characters. However, as you say, we shall see. I fancy that I know someone who would be quite willing to have such a diamond as this, and moreover, would be willing to pay a fair price for its possession. I will take it to him and see what he says. Pugh, hand me back that diamond. My dear Tress, I was only going to. Bob came in with the breakfast tray. Pugh, you will either hand that back to me at once, or Bob shall summon the representatives of law and order. He handed me the diamond. I sat down to breakfast with a hearty appetite. Pugh stood and scowled at me. Joseph Tress, it is my solemn conviction, and I have no hesitation in saying so in plain English, that you're a thief. My dear Pugh, it seems to me that we show every promise of becoming a couple of thieves. Don't bracket me with you. Not at all. You are worse than I. It is you who declined to return the contents of the box to its proper owner. Put it to yourself. You have some common sense, my dear old friend. Do you suppose that a diamond worth more than £1,000 is to be honestly bought for a ninepence? He resumed his old trick of dancing around the room. I was a fool ever to let you have the box. I ought to have known better than to have trusted you. Goodness knows you have given me sufficient cause to mistrust you, over and over again. Your character is only too notorious. You have plundered friend and foe alike, friend and foe alike. As for the rubbish which you call your collection, 9/10 of it, I know as a positive fact you have stolen out and out. Who stole my Sir Walter Raleigh pipe? Wasn't it a man named Pugh? Look here, Joseph Tress. I'm looking. Oh, it's no good talking to you, not in the least. You're dead to all the promptings of conscience. May I inquire, Mr. Tress, what it is you propose to do? I propose to do nothing, except summon the representatives of law and order. Failing that, my dear Pugh, I had some faint, vague, very vague idea of taking the contents of your ninepenny puzzle to a certain firm in Hatton Garden, who are dealers in precious stones, and to learn from them if they are disposed to give anything for it, and if so, what. I shall come with you. With pleasure, on condition that you pay the cab. I pay the cab? I'll pay half. Not at all. You either pay the whole fare, or else I will have one cab and you'll have another. It's a 3-shilling cab fare from here to Hatton Garden. If you propose to share my cab, you'll be so good as to hand over that 3 shillings before we start. He gasped, but he handed over the 3 shillings. There are a few things I enjoy so much as getting money out of Pugh. On the road to Hatton Garden we wrangled nearly all the way. I own that I feel certain satisfaction in irritating Pugh. He is such an irritable man. He wanted to know what I thought we should get for the diamond. You can't expect to get much for the contents of a ninepenny puzzle, not even the price of a cab fare, Pugh. He eyed me, but for some minutes he was silent. Then he began again. Tress, I don't think we ought to let it go for less than £5,000. Seriously, Pugh, I doubt whether, when the whole affair is ended, we shall get 5,000 pence for it, or for that matter 5,000 farthings. Why not? Why not? It's a magnificent stone, magnificent. I'll stake my life on it. I tapped my breast with the tips of my fingers. There's a warning voice within my breast that ought to be in yours, Pugh. Something tells me, perhaps it is the unusually strong vein of common sense which I possess, that the contents of your ninepenny puzzle will be found to be a magnificent do, an ingenious practical joke, my friend. I don't believe it, but I think he did. At any rate, I had unsettled the foundations of his faith. We entered the Hatton Garden office side by side. In his anxiety not to let me get before him, Pugh actually clung to my arm. The office was divided into 2 parts by a counter which ran from wall to wall. I advanced to a man who stood on the other side of this counter. I want to sell you a diamond. We want to sell you a diamond. interpolated Pugh. I turned to Pugh. I fixed him with my glance. I want to sell you a diamond. Here it is. What will you give me for it? Taking the crystal from my waistcoat pocket, I handed it to the man on the other side of the counter. Directly he got it between his fingers, and saw that it was that he had got, I noticed a sudden gleam came into his eyes. This is a rather fine stone. Pugh nudged my arm. I told you so. Paid no attention to Pugh. What will you give me for it? Do you mean, what will I give you for it cash down upon the nail? Just so. What will you give me for it cash down upon the nail? The man turned the crystal over and over in his fingers. Well, that's rather a large order. We don't often get a chance of buying such a stone as this across the counter. What do you say to 10,000 pounds? 10,000 pounds! It was beyond my wildest imaginings. Pugh gasped. He lurched against the counter. 10,000 pounds, he echoed. The man on the other side glanced at him, I thought, a little curiously. If you can give me references, or satisfy me in any way as to your bona fides, I'm prepared to give you for this diamond an open check for 10,000 pounds, or if you prefer it, the cash instead. I stared. I was not accustomed to see business transacted on quite such lines as those. We'll take it, murmured Pugh. I believe he was too much overcome by his feelings to do more than murmur. I interposed. My dear sir, you will excuse my saying that you arrive very rapidly at your conclusion. In your first place, how can you make sure that it is a diamond? The man behind the counter smiled. I should be very ill-fitted for the position which I hold if I could not tell a diamond directly I get sight of it, especially such a stone as this. But have you no tests you can apply? We have tests which we can apply in cases when doubt exists, but in this case there is no doubt whatsoever. I am as sure that this is a diamond as I am sure that it is air I breathe. However, there is a test. There was a wheel close by the speaker. It was worked by a treadle. It was more like a superior sort of traveling tinker's grindstone than anything else. The man behind the counter put his foot upon the treadle. The wheel began to revolve. He brought the crystal into contact with the swiftly revolving wheel. There was a sh, and instantly his hand was empty. The crystal had vanished into the air. Good heavens, he gasped. I never saw such a look of amazement on a human countenance before. It's splintered. Postscript. It was a diamond, although it had splintered. In that fact lay the point of the joke. The man behind the counter had not been wrong. Examination of such dust as could be collected proved that fact beyond a doubt. It was declared by experts that the diamond, at some period of its history, had been subjected to intense and continued heat. The result had been to make it as brittle as glass. There could be no doubt that its original owner had been an expert, too. He knew where he had got it from, and he probably knew what it had endured. He was aware that from a mercantile's point of view it was worthless, so it could never have been cut. So, having a turn for humor of a particular kind, he had devoted days and weeks and possibly months to the construction of that puzzle. He had placed the diamond inside and had enjoyed, in anticipation and in imagination, the Al-Nashtar visions of the lucky finder. Pugh blamed me for the catastrophe. He said, and still says, that if I had not, in a measure and quite gratuitously, insisted on the test, the man behind the counter would have been satisfied with the evidence of his organs of vision, and we should have been richer by 10,000 pounds. But I did satisfy my conscience with the reflection that what I did at any rate was honest, though at the same time I am perfectly aware that such a reflection gives Pugh no sort of satisfaction. End of section 17.
Section 18 of Library of the World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Library of the World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 3, by Julian Hawthorne, Editor. Section 18. The Great Valdez Sapphire. by Anonymous. I know more about it than anyone else in the world, its present owner not excepted. I can give its whole history, from the Cingalese who found it, the Spanish adventurer who stole it, the cardinal who bought it, the pope who graciously accepted it, the favored son of the church who received it, the gay and giddy duchess who pawned it, down to the eminent prelate who now holds it in trust as a family heirloom. It will occupy a chapter to itself in my forthcoming work on Historic Stones, where full details of its weight, size, color, and value may be found. At present I am going to relate an incident in its history which, for obvious reasons, will not be published, which in fact I trust the reader will consider related in strict confidence. I had never seen the stone itself when I began to write about it, and it was not till one evening last spring, while staying with my nephew Sir Thomas Acton, that I came within measurable distance of it. A dinner party was impending, and at my instigation, the Bishop of Northchurch and Miss Panton, his daughter and heiress, were among the invited guests. The dinner was a particularly good one. I remember that distinctly. In fact, I felt myself partly responsible for it, having engaged the new cook, a talented young Italian, pupil of the admirable old chef at my club. We had gone over the menu carefully together, with a result refreshing in its novelty, but not so daring as to disturb the minds of the innocent country guests who were bidden thereto. The first spoonful of soup was reassuring, and I looked to the end of the table to exchange a congratulatory glance with Leta. What was amiss? No response. Her pretty face was flushed, her smile constrained. She was talking with quite unnecessary empressement to her neighbor, Sir Harry Landor, though Leta is one of those few women who understand the importance of letting a man settle down tranquilly and with an undisturbed mind to the business of dining, allowing no topic of serious interest to come on before the releve, and reserving more conversational brilliancy for the entremets. Guests all right? No disappointments? I had gone through the list with her, selecting just the right people to be asked to meet the Landors, our new neighbors. Not a mere cumbrous country gathering, nor yet a showy imported party from town, but a skilful blending of both. Had anything happened already? I had been late for dinner, and missed the arrivals in the drawing-room. It was Leta's fault. She has got a way of coming into my room and putting the last touches to my toilet. I let her, for I am doubtful of myself nowadays after many years' dependence on the best of valets. Her taste is generally beyond dispute, but today she had indulged in a feminine vagary, which provoked me and made me late for dinner. "Are you going to wear your sapphire, Uncle Paul?" she cried in a tone of dismay. "Oh, why not the ruby?" "You would have your way about the table decorations," I gently reminded her. "With that service of Crown Derby wraps and orchids, the ruby would look absolutely barbaric. Now if you would have had the limages set, white candles, and a yellow silk centre—" "Oh, but I am so disappointed! I wanted the bishop to see your ruby, or one of your engraved gems." "My dear, it is on the bishop's account I put this on. You know his daughter is heiress of the great Valdez sapphire." "Of course she is. And when he has the charge of a stone 3 times as big as yours, what's the use of wearing it? The ruby, dear Uncle Paul, please." She was desperately in earnest, I could see, and considering the obligations which I am supposed to be under to her and Tom, it was but a little matter to yield. But it involved a good deal of extra trouble. Studs, sleeve links, watch guard, all carefully selected to go with the sapphire, had to be changed, the emerald which I chose as a compromise requiring more florid accompaniments of a deeper tone of gold. And the dinner hour struck as I replaced my jewel case, the one relic left me of a once handsome fortune, in my fireproof safe. The emerald looked very well that evening, however. I kept my eyes upon it for comfort when Miss Panton proved trying. She was a lean, yellow, dictatorial young person with no conversation. I spoke of her father's celebrated sapphires. My sapphires, she amended sourly, though I am legally debarred from making any profitable use of them. She furthermore informed me that she viewed them as useless gauds, which ought to be disposed of for the benefit of the heathen. I gave the subject up, and while she discoursed on the work of the Blue Ribbon Army among the Bosjesmans, I tried to understand a certain dislocation in the arrangement of the table. Surely we were more or less in number than we should be. Opposite side, all right. Who was extra on ours? I leaned forward. Lady Landor on one side of Tom. On the other, who? I caught glimpses of plumes, pink and green, nodding over a dinner plate, and beneath them a pink nose and a green visage, with a nutcracker chin altogether unknown to me. A sharp grey eye shot a wide glance down the table and caught me peeping, and I retreated, having only marked in addition 2 claw-like hands, with pointed ruffles and a mass of brilliant rings, making good play with a knife and fork. Who was she? At intervals, a high, acid voice could be heard addressing Tom, and a laugh that made me shudder. It had the quality of the scream of a bird of prey or the yell of a jackal. I had heard that sort of laugh before, and it always made me feel like a defenseless rabbit. Every time it sounded, I saw Leta's fan flutter more furiously, and her manner grow more nervously animated. Poor dear girl! I never in all my recollection wished a dinner at an end so earnestly, so as to assure her of my support and sympathy, though without the faintest conception why either should be required. The ices at last. A menu card folded in 2 was laid beside me. I read it unobserved. Keep the B from joining us in the drawing-room. The B? The bishop, of course. With pleasure. But why? And how? That's the question. Never mind why. Could I lure him into the library? The billiard-room? The conservatory? I doubted it, and I doubted still more what I should do with him when I got him there. The bishop is a grand and stately ecclesiastic of the medieval type, broad-chested, deep-voiced, martial of bearing. I could picture him charging mace in hand at the head of his vassals, or delivering over a dissenter of the period to the rack and thumbscrew, but not pottering among rare editions, tall copies and grolier bindings, not condescending to a quiet cigar among the tree ferns and orchids. Leta must and should be obeyed. I swore, nevertheless, even if I were driven to lock the door in the fearless old fashion of a bygone day, and declare I'd shoot any man who left while a drop remained in the bottles. The ladies were rising. The lady at the head of the line smirked and nodded her pink plumes coquettishly at Tom, while her hawk's eyes roved keen and predatory over us all. She stopped suddenly, creating a block and confusion. "Ah, the dear bishop! You, there, and I never saw you. You must come and have a nice long chat presently. Bye-bye." She shook her fan at him over my shoulder and tripped off. Leta, passing me last, gave a look of profound despair. "Lady Carwitchet!" somebody exclaimed. I couldn't believe my eyes. "Thought she was dead or in penal servitude. Never should have expected to see her here," said someone else behind me confidentially. "What Carwitchet? Not the mother of the Carwitchet who—" "Just so. The Carwitchet who—" Tom assented with a shrug. "We needn't go farther, as she's my guest. Just my luck. I met them at Buxton, thought them uncommonly good company. In fact, Carwitchet laid me under a great obligation about a horse I was nearly let in for buying, and gave them a general invitation here, as one does, you know. Never expected her to turn up with her luggage this afternoon just before dinner, to stay a week or a fortnight if Carwitchet can join her." A groan of sympathy ran round the table. "It can't be helped. I told you this just to show that I shouldn't have asked you here to meet this sort of people of my own free will, but as it is, please say no more about them." The subject was not dropped by any means, and I took care that it should not be. At our end of the table one story after another went buzzing round, sotto voce, out of deference to Tom, but perfectly audible. Cartwitchet? Ah, yes. Mixed up in that Rawlings divorce case, wasn't he? A bad lot. Turned out of the Dragoon Guards for cheating at cards, or picking pockets, or something. Remember the row at the Cerulean Club? Scandalous exposure, and that forged letter business. Oh, that was the mother. Prosecution hushed up somehow. Ought to be serving her 14 years. And that business of poor Ferrers, the banker. Got hold of some of his secrets and blackmailed him till he blew his brains out. It was so exciting that I clean forgot the bishop, till a low gasp at my elbow startled me. He was lying back in his chair, his mighty shaven jowl a ghastly white, his fierce imperious eyebrows drooping limp over his fish-like eyes, his splendid figure shrunk and contracted. He was trying with a shaken hand to pour out wine. The decanter clattered against the glass and the wine spilled on the cloth. "I'm afraid you find the room too warm. Shall we go into the library?" He rose hastily and followed me like a lamb. He recovered himself once we got into the hall, and affably rejected all my proffers of brandy and soda, medical advice, everything else my limited experience could suggest. He only demanded his carriage directly, and that Miss Panton should be summoned forthwith. I made the best use I could of the time left me. "I'm uncommonly sorry you do not feel equal to staying a little longer, my lord. I counted on showing you my few trifles of precious stones, the salvage from the wreck of my possessions. Nothing in comparison with your own collection." The bishop clasped his hand over his heart. His breath came short and quick. "A return of that dizziness," he explained with a faint smile. "You are thinking of the Valdez sapphire, are you not? Some day," he went on with forced composure, "I may have the pleasure of showing it to you. It is at my banker's just now." Miss Panton's steps were heard in the hall. "You are well known as a connoisseur, Mr. Acton," he went on hurriedly. "Is your collection valuable? If so, keep it safe. Don't trust a ring off your hand, or the key of your jewel case out of your pocket till the house is clear again." The words rushed from his lips in an impetuous whisper. He gave me a meaning glance, and departed with his daughter. I went back to the drawing-room, my head swimming with bewilderment. "What! The dear bishop gone?" screamed Lady Cartwitchet from the central ottoman where she sat, surrounded by most of the gentlemen, all apparently well entertained by her conversation. "And I wanted to talk over old times with him so badly. His poor wife was my greatest friend. Mira Montanaro, daughter of the great banker, you know. It's not possible that the miserable little prig is my poor Myra's girl, the heiress of all the Montanaros in a black lace gown worth 2 pence. When I think of her mother's beauty and her toilets— does she ever wear the sapphires? Has anyone ever seen her in them? 11 large stones in a lovely antique setting, and the great Valdez sapphire, worth thousands and thousands, for the pendant." No one replied. I wanted to get a rise out of the bishop tonight. It used to make him so mad when I wore this. She fumbled among the laces at her throat, and clawed out a pendant that hung to a velvet band around her neck. I fairly gasped when she removed her hand. A sapphire of irregular shape flashed out its blue lightning on us. Such a stone! A true, rich, cornflower blue, even by that wretched artificial light, with soft velvety depths of color and dazzling clearness of tint in its lights and shades. A stone to remember. I stretched out my hand involuntarily, but Lady Cartwitchet drew back with a coquettish squeal. "No, no! You mustn't look any closer. Tell me what you think of it now. Isn't it pretty?" "Superb!" was all I could ejaculate, staring at the azure splendor of that miraculous jewel in a sort of trance. She gave a shrill cackling laugh of mockery. "The great Mr. Acton taken in by a bit of Palais Royal gimcrackery. What an advertisement for Bogart at sea. They are perfect artists and frauds. Don't you remember their stand at the first Paris exhibition? They had imitations there of every celebrated stone. But I never expected anything made by man could delude Mr. Acton. Never!" And she went off into another mocking cackle, and all the idiots round her haw-hawed knowingly, as if they had seen the joke all along. I was too bewildered to reply, which was lucky on the whole. I suppose I mustn't tell why I came to give quite a big sum in francs for this, she went on, tapping her closed lips with her closed fan, and cocking her eye at us all like a parrot wanting to be coaxed to talk. It's a queer story. I didn't want to hear her anecdote, especially as I saw she wanted to tell it. What I did want was to see that pendant again. She had thrust it back among her laces, only the loop which held it to the velvet being visible. It was set with 3 small sapphires, and even from a distance, I clearly made them out to be imitations, and poor ones. I felt a queer thrill of mistrust. Was the large stone no better? Could I, even for an instant, have been dazzled by a sham, and a sham of that quality? The events of the evening had flurried and confused me. I wished to think them over in quiet. I would go to bed. My rooms at the manor are the best in the house. Lita would have it so. I must explain their position for a reason to be understood later. My bedroom is in the southeast angle of the house. It opens on one side into a sitting room in the east corridor, the rest of which is taken up by the suite of rooms occupied by Tom and Lita, and on the other side into my bathroom, the first room in the south corridor, where the principal guest chambers are, to one of which it was originally the dressing room. Passing this room, I noticed a couple of housemaids preparing it for the night, and discovered with a shiver that Lady Carwitchet was to be my next-door neighbor. It gave me a turn. The bishop's strange warning must have unnerved me. I was perfectly safe from her ladyship. The disused door into her room was locked, and the key safe on the housekeeper's bunch. It was also undiscoverable on her side, the recess in which it stood being completely filled by a large wardrobe. On my side hung a thick sound-proof portiere. Nevertheless, I resolved not to use that room while she inhabited the next one. I removed my possessions, fastened the door of communication with my bedroom, and dragged a heavy ottoman across it. Then I stowed away my emerald in my strong-box. It is built into the wall of my sitting-room, and masked by the lower part of an old carved oak bureau. I put away even the rings I wore habitually, keeping out only an inferior cat's eye for workaday wear. I had just made all safe when Lita tapped at the door and came in to wish me good night. She looked flushed and harassed and ready to cry. "Uncle Paul," she began, "I want you to go up to town at once and stay away till I send for you." "My dear!" I was too amazed to expostulate. "We've got a pestilence among us," she declared, her foot tapping the ground angrily. "And the least we can do is to go into quarantine. Oh, I'm so sorry and so ashamed. The poor bishop! I'll take good care that no one else shall meet that woman here. You did your best for me, Uncle Paul, and managed admirably, but it was all no use. I hoped against hope that what between the dusk of the drawing-room before dinner, and being put at opposite ends of the table, we might get through without a meeting. But, my dear, explain. Why shouldn't the bishop and Lady Carwitchet meet? Why is it worse for him than anyone else? Why, I thought everybody had heard of that dreadful wife of his who nearly broke his heart. If he married her for her money it served him right, but Lady Lander says she was very handsome and really in love with him at first. Then Lady Carwitchet got hold of her and led her into all sorts of mischief. She left her husband — he was only a rector with a country living in those days — and went to live in town, got into a horrid fast set, and made herself notorious. You must have heard of her." "I heard of her sapphires, my dear, but I was in Brazil at the time." "I wish you had been at home. You might have found her out. She was furious because her husband refused to let her wear the great Valdez sapphire. It had been in the Montenero family for some generations, and her father settled it first on her and then on her little girl, the bishop being trustee. He felt obliged to take away the little girl and send her off to be brought up by some old aunts in the country, and he locked up the sapphire. Lady Carwitchet tells as a splendid joke how they got the copy made in Paris, and it did just as well for the people to stare at. No wonder the bishop hates the very name of the stone." "How long will she stay here?" I asked dismally. till Lord Cartwitchet can come and escort her to Paris to visit some American friends. Goodness knows when that will be. Do go up to town, Uncle Paul." I refused indignantly. The very least I could do was to stand by my poor young relatives in their troubles and help them through. I did so. I wore that inferior cat's eye for 6 weeks. It is a time I cannot think of even now without a shudder. The more I saw of that terrible old woman, the more I detested her, and we saw a very great deal of her. Leta kept her word, and neither accepted nor gave invitations all that time. We were cut off from all society but that of the old General Fairford, who would go anywhere and meet anyone to get a rubber after dinner, the doctor a sporting widower, and the Duberlys, a giddy, rather rackety young couple who had taken the Dower House for a year. Lady Cartwitchet seemed perfectly content. She revelled in the soft living and good fare of the manor house, the drives in Leta's big barouche, and Domenico's dinners, as one to whom short commons were not unknown. She had a hungry way of grabbing and grasping at everything she could. The shillings she wanted whist, the best fruit at dessert, the postage stamps in the library inkstand. That was infinitely suggestive. Sometimes I could have pitied her. She was so greedy, so spiteful, so friendless. She always made me think of some wicked old pirate putting into a peaceful port to provision and repair his battered old hulk, obliged to live on friendly terms with the natives, but his piratical old nostrils a-sniff for plunder and his piratical old soul longing to be off marauding once more. When would that be? Not till the arrival in Paris of her distinguished American friends, of whom we heard a great deal. Charming people, the Buckums of Chicago, the American branch of the English Beauchamps, you know. They seemed to be taking an unconscionable time to get there. She would have insisted on being driven over to Northchurch to call at the palace, but that the bishop was understood to be holding confirmations at the other end of the diocese. I was alone in the house one afternoon, sitting by my window, toying with the key of my safe, and wondering whether I dare treat myself to a peep at my treasures, when a suspicious movement in the park below caught my attention. A black figure certainly dodged from behind one tree to the next, and then into the shadow of the park paling instead of keeping to the footpath. It looked queer. I caught up my field glass and marked him at one point where he was bound to come into the open for a few steps. He crossed the strip of turf with giant strides and got into cover again, but not quick enough to prevent my recognizing him. It was, great heavens, the bishop! In a soft hat, pulled over his forehead, with a long cloak, and a big stick, he looked like a poacher. Guided by some mysterious instinct, I hurried to meet him. I opened the conservatory door, and in he rushed like a hunted rabbit. Without explanation, I led him up the wide staircase to my room, where he dropped into a chair and wiped his face. "You are astonished, Mr. Acton," he panted. "I will explain directly. Thanks." He tossed off the glass of brandy I had poured out without waiting for the qualifying soda, and looked better. "I am in serious trouble. You can help me. I've had a shock to-day, a grievous shock." He stopped and tried to pull himself together. "I must trust you implicitly, Mr. Acton. I have no choice. Tell me what you think of this." He drew a case from his breast pocket and opened it. "I promised you should see the Valdez sapphire. Look there." The Valdez sapphire, a great big shining lump of blue crystal, flawless and of perfect color. That was all. I took it up, breathed on it, drew out my magnifier, looked at it in one light and another. What was wrong with it? I could not say. 9 experts out of 10 would undoubtedly have pronounced the stone genuine. I, by virtue of some mysterious instinct that has hitherto always guided me aright, was the unlucky 10th. I looked at the bishop. His eyes met mine. There was no need of spoken word between us. "Has Lady Cartwitchet shown you her sapphire?" was his most unexpected question. "She has?" Now, Mr. Acton, on your honor as a connoisseur and a gentleman, which of the two is the Valdez? Not this one. I could say naught else. You were my last hope. He broke off, and dropped his face on his folded arms with a groan that shook the table on which he rested, while I stood dismayed at myself for having let so hasty a judgment escape me. He lifted a ghastly countenance to me. She vowed she would see me ruined and disgraced. I made her my enemy by crossing some of her schemes once, and she never forgives. She will keep her word. I shall appear before the world as a fraudulent trustee. I can neither produce the valuable confined to my charge, nor make the loss good. I have only an incredible story to tell. He dropped his head and groaned again. Who will believe me? I will, for one. Ah, you? Yes, you know her. She took my wife from me, Mr. Acton. Heaven only knows what the hold was that she had over poor Myra. She encouraged her to set me at defiance, and eventually to leave me. She was answerable for all the scandalous folly and extravagance of poor Myra's life in Paris. Spare me the telling of the story. She left her at last to die alone and uncared for. I reached my wife to find her dying of a fever from which Lady Cartwitchet and her crew had fled. She was raving in delirium and died without recognizing me. Some trouble she had been in, which I must never know, oppressed her. At the very last she roused from a long stupor and spoke to the nurse. "Tell him to get the sapphire back. She stole it. She has robbed my child." Those were her last words. The nurse understood no English, and treated them as wondering. But I heard them, and knew she was sane when she spoke. "What did you do?" What could I do? I saw Lady Cartwitchet, who laughed at me, and defied me to make her confess or disgorge. I took the pendant to more than one eminent jeweller on pretence of having the setting seen to, and all have examined and admired without giving a hint of there being anything wrong. I allowed a celebrated mineralogist to see it. He gave no sign. Perhaps they are right and we are wrong. No, listen. I heard of an old Dutchman celebrated for his imitations. I went to him, and he told me at once that he had been allowed by Montenero to copy the Valdez, setting and all, for the Paris exhibition. I showed him this, and he claimed it for his own work at once, and pointed out his private mark upon it. You must take your magnifier to find it, a Greek beta. He told me that he had sold it to Lady Cartwitchet more than a year ago. It is a terrible position. It is. My co-trustee died lately. I have never dared to have another appointed. I am bound to hand over the sapphire to my daughter on her marriage, if her husband consents to take the name of Montenero. The bishop's face was ghastly pale, and the moisture started on his brow. I racked my brain for some word of comfort. Miss Panton may never marry. "But she will!" he shouted. "That is the blow that has been dealt me to-day. My chaplain, actually my chaplain, tells me that he is going out as a temperance missionary to Equatorial Africa, and has the assurance to add that he believes my daughter is not indisposed to accompany him." His consummating wrath acted as a momentary stimulant. He sat upright, his eyes flashing and his brows thunderous. I felt for that chaplain. Then he collapsed miserably. The sapphires will have to be produced, identified, revalued. How shall I come out of it? Think of the disgrace, the ripping up of old scandals. Even if I were to compound with Lady Cartwitchet, the sum she hinted at was too monstrous. She wants more than my money. Help me, Mr. Acton. For the sake of your own family interests, help me. I beg your pardon. Family interests? I don't understand. If my daughter is childless, her next of kin is poor Marmaduke Panton, who is dying at Cannes, not married, or likely to marry, and failing him, your nephew, Sir Thomas Acton, succeeds. My nephew Tom, Lita, or Lita's baby, might come to be the possible inheritor of the great Valdez sapphire. The blood rushed to my head as I looked at the great shining swindle before me. What diabolical jugglery was at work when the exchange was made? I demanded fiercely. It must have been on the last occasion of her wearing the sapphires in London. I ought never to have let her out of my sight. You must put a stop to Miss Panton's marriage in the first place, I pronounced as autocratically as he could have done himself. Not to be thought of, he admitted helplessly. Myra has my force of character. She knows her rights, and she will have her jewels. I want you to take charge of the thing for me. If it's in the house, she'll make me produce it. She'll inquire at the bankers. If you have it, we can gain time, if but for a day or two. He broke off. Carriage wheels were crashing on the gravel outside. We looked at one another in consternation. Flight was imperative. I hurried him downstairs and out of the conservatory just as the doorbell rang. I think we both lost our heads in the confusion. He shoved the case into my hands, and I pocketed it, without a thought of the awful responsibility I was incurring, and saw him disappear into the shelter of the friendly night. When I think of what my feelings were that evening, of my murderous hatred of that smirking, jesting Jezebel who sat opposite me at dinner, my wrathful indignation at the thought of the poor little expected heir defrauded ere his birth, of the crushing contempt I felt for myself and the bishop as a pair of witless idiots, unable to see our way out of the dilemma, all this was boiling and surging through my soul. I can only wonder, Domenico having given himself a holiday, and the kitchen maid doing her worst and wickedest, that gout or jaundice did not put an end to this story at once. Uncle Paul? Lita was looking her sweetest when she tripped into my room next morning. I've news for you. She, pointing a delicate forefinger in the direction of the corridor, is going. Her Buckums have reached Paris at last, and sent for her to join them at the Grand Hotel. I was thunderstruck. The longed-for deliverance had but come to remove hopelessly and forever out of my reach Lady Carwitchet and the great Valdez Sapphire. Why aren't you overjoyed? I am. We are going to celebrate the event by a dinner party. Tom's hospitable soul is vexed by the lack of entertainment we had provided her. We must ask the Brownleys some day or other, and they will be delighted to meet anything in the way of a ladyship, or such smart folks as the Duberly Parkers. Then we may as well have the Blomfields, and air that awful modern Sevres dessert service she gave us when we were married. I had no objection to make, and she went on, rubbing her soft cheek against my shoulder, like the purring little cat she was. Now I want you to do something to please me, and Mrs. Blomfield. She has set her heart on seeing your rubies, and though I know you hate her about as much as you do that Sevres china— What? Wear my rubies with that? I won't. I'll tell you what I will do, though. I've got some carbuncles as big as prize gooseberries, a whole set. Then you have only to put those Bohemian glass vases and candelabra on the table, and let your gardener do his worst with his great forced, scentless vulgar blooms, and we shall all be in keeping. Leda pouted. An idea struck me. Or I'll do as you wish, on one condition. You get Lady Carwitchet to wear her big sapphire, and don't tell her I wish it. I lived through the next few days as one in some evil dream. The sapphires, like twin spectres, haunted me day and night. Was ever man so tantalized? To hold the shadow and see the substance dangled temptingly within reach. The bishop made no sign of ridding me of my unwelcome charge, and the thought of what might happen in a case of burglary, fire, earthquake, made me start and tremble at all sorts of inopportune moments. I kept faith with Lita, and reluctantly produced my beautiful rubies on the night of her dinner party. Emerging from my room, I came full upon Lady Carwitchet in the corridor. She was dressed for dinner, and at her throat I caught the blue gleam of the great sapphire. Lita had kept faith with me. I don't know what I stammered in reply to her ladyship's remarks. My whole soul was absorbed in the contemplation of the intoxicating loveliness of the gem. That a Palais Royal deception? Incredible. My fingers twitched. My breath came short and fierce with the lust of possession. She must have seen the covetous glare in my eyes. A look of gratified, spiteful complacency overspread her features, as she swept on ahead and descended the stairs before me. I followed her to the drawing-room door. She stopped suddenly, and, murmuring something unintelligible, hurried back again. Everybody was assembled there that I expected to see, with an addition. Not a welcome one by the look of Tom's face. He stood on the hearthrug conversing with a great, hulking, high-shouldered fellow, sallow-faced, with a heavy moustache and drooping eyelids, from the corners of which flashed out a sudden suspicious look as I approached, which lighted up into a greedy one as it rested on my rubies, and seemed unaccountably familiar to me, till Lady Carwitchet, tripping past me, exclaimed, "He has come at last! My naughty, naughty boy! Mr. Acton, this is my son, Lord Carwitchet." I broke off short in the midst of my polite acknowledgments, to stare blankly at her. The sapphire was gone. A great gilt cross, with a Scotch pebble like an acid drop, was her sole decoration. "I had to put my pendant away," she exclaimed confidentially. "The clasp had got broken somehow." I didn't believe a word. Lord Carwitchet contributed little to the general entertainment at dinner, but fell into confidential talk with Mrs. Duberly Parker. I caught a few unintelligible remarks across the table. They referred, I subsequently discovered, to the lady's little book on Northchurch races, and I recollected that the spring meeting was on, and tomorrow, Cup Day. After dinner there was great talk about getting up a party to go to General Fairford's drag. Lady Carwitchet was in ecstasies and tried to coax me into joining. Lita declined positively. Tom accepted sulkily. The look in Lord Carwitchet's eye returned to my mind as I locked up my rubies that night. It made him look so like his mother. I looked around my fastenings with unusual care. Safe and closets and desks and doors, I tried them all. Coming at last to the bathroom, it opened at once. It was the housemaid's doing. She had evidently taken advantage of my having abandoned the room to give it a thorough spring cleaning, and I anathematized her. The furniture was all piled together and veiled with sheets. The carpet and felt curtain were gone, and there were new brooms about. As I peered around, a voice close at my ear made me jump. Lady Carwitchet's. "I tell you I have nothing, not a penny. I shall have to borrow my train fare before I can leave this. They'll be glad enough to lend it." Not only had the portiere been removed, but the door behind it had been unlocked and left open for convenience of dusting behind the wardrobe. I might as well have been in the bedroom. "Don't tell me." I recognized Carwitchet's growl. "You've not been here all this time for nothing. You've been collecting for a Kilburn cot, or getting subscriptions for the distressed Irish landlords. I know you. Now I'm not going to see myself ruined for the want of a paltry 100 or so. I tell you the colt is a dead certainty. If I could have got 1,000 or 2 on him last week, we might have ended our dog days millionaires. Hand over what you can. You've money's worth, if not money. Where's that sapphire you stole?" "I didn't. I can show you the receipted bill. All I possess is honestly come by. What could you do with it, even if I gave it you? You couldn't sell it as the Valdez, and you can't get it cut up as you might if it were real. If it's only bogus, why are you always in such a flutter about it? I'll do something with it, never fear. Hand over." "I can't. I haven't got it. I had to raise something on it before I left town." "Will you swear it's not in that wardrobe?" "I dare say you will. I mean to see. Give me those keys." I heard a struggle and a jingle, and the wardrobe door must have been flung open, for a streak of light struck through a crack in the wood of the back. Creeping close and peeping through, I could see an awful sight. Lady Carwitchet in a flannel wrapper, minus hair, teeth, complexion, pointing a skinny forefinger that quivered with rage at her son, who was out of the range of my vision. "Stop that, and throw those keys down here directly, or I'll rouse the house. Sir Thomas is a magistrate, and will lock you up as soon as look at you." She clutched at the bell rope as she spoke. "I'll swear I'm in danger of my life from you, and give you in charge. Yes, and when you're in prison, I'll keep you there till you die. I've often thought I'd do it. How about the hotel robberies last summer at Kooz, eh? Mightn't the police be grateful for a hint or two? And how about—" The keys fell with a crash on the bed, accompanied by some bad language in an apologetic tone, and the door slammed to. I crept trembling to bed. This new and horrible complication of the situation filled me with dismay. Lord Carwitchet's wolfish glance at my rubies took a new meaning. They were safe enough, I believed. But the sapphire! If he disbelieved his mother, how long would she be able to keep it from his clutches? That she had some plot of her own, of which the bishop would eventually be the victim, I did not doubt, or why had she not made her bargain with him long ago? But supposing she took fright, lost her head, allowed her son to wrest the jewel from her, or gave consent to its being mutilated, divided? I lay in a cold perspiration till morning. My terrors haunted me all day. They were with me at breakfast time when Lady Carwitchet, tripping in smiling, made a last attempt to induce me to accompany her and keep her bad, bad boy from getting among those horrid betting men. They haunted me through the long, peaceful day with Leta and the tete-a-tete dinner, but they swarmed around and beset me sorest when, sitting alone over my sitting-room fire, I listened for the return of the drag party. I read my newspaper and brewed myself some hot strong drink, but there comes a time of night when no fire can warm and no drink can cheer. The bishop's despairing face kept me company, and his troubles and the wrongs of the future heir took possession of me. Then the uncanny noises that make all old houses ghostly during the small hours began to make themselves heard. Muffled footsteps trod the corridor, stopping to listen at every door. Door latches gently clicked. Boards creaked unreasonably. Sounds of stealthy movements came from the locked-up bathroom. The welcome crash of wheels at last, and the sound of the front door bell. I could hear Lady Carwitchet making her shrill adieu to her friends and her steps in the corridor. She was softly humming a little song as she approached. I heard her unlock her bedroom door before she entered, an odd thing to do. Tom came sleepily stumbling to his room later. I put my head out. "Where is Lord Carwitchet?" "Haven't you seen him? He left us hours ago." "Not come home, eh? Well, he's welcome to stay away. I don't want to see more of him." Tom's brow was dark, and his voice surly. "I gave him to understand as much." Whatever had happened, Tom was evidently too disgusted to explain just then. I went back to my fire unaccountably relieved, and brewed myself another and a stronger brew. It warmed me this time, but excited me foolishly. There must be some way out of the difficulty. I felt now as if I could almost see it if I gave my mind to it. Why, suppose there might be no difficulty at all. The bishop was a nervous old gentleman. He might have been mistaken all through. Bogarts might have been mistaken. I might. No. I could not have been mistaken, or I thought not. I fidgeted and fumed and argued with myself till I found I should have no peace of mind without a look at the stone in my possession, and I actually went to the safe and took the case out. The sapphire certainly looked different by lamplight. I sat and stared, and all but over-persuaded my better judgment into giving it a verdict. Bogart's mark. I suddenly remembered it. I took my magnifier and held the pendant to the light. There, scratched upon the stone, was the Greek beta. There came a tap on my door, and before I could answer, the handle turned softly, and Lord Carwitchet stood before me. I whipped the case into my dressing-gown pocket and stared at him. He was not pleasant to look at, especially at that time of night. He had a dishevelled, desperate air. His voice was hoarse, his red-rimmed eyes wild. "I beg your pardon," he began civilly enough. "I saw your light burning, and thought, as we go by the early train to-morrow, you might allow me to consult you now on a little business of my mother's." His eyes roved about the room. Was he trying to find the whereabouts of my safe? You know a lot about precious stones, don't you? So my friends are kind enough to say. Won't you sit down? I have unluckily little chance of indulging the taste of my own account, was my cautious reply. But you've written a book about them and know them when you see them, don't you? Now my mother has given me something and would like you to give a guess at its value. Perhaps you can put me in the way of disposing of it. I certainly can do so if it is worth anything. Is that it? I was in a fever of excitement, for I guessed what was clutched in his palm. He held out to me the Valdez sapphire. How it shone and sparkled like a great blue star. I made myself a deprecating smile as I took it from him. But how dare I call it false to its face? As well accuse the sun in heaven of being a cheap imitation. I faltered and prevaricated feebly. Where was my moral courage, and where was the good, honest, thumping lie that should have aided me? I have the best authority for recognizing this as the very good copy of a famous stone in the possession of the Bishop of Northchurch. His scowl grew so black that I saw he believed me, and I went on more cheerily. This was manufactured by Johannes Bockert. I can give you his address, and you can make inquiries yourself, by special permission of the then owner, the late Leon Montenero. Hand it back, he interrupted. His other remarks were outrageous, but satisfactory to hear. But I waved him off. I couldn't give it up. It fascinated me. I toyed with it. I caressed it. I made it display its different tones of color. I must see the two stones together. I must see it outshine its paltry rival. It was a whimsical frenzy that seized me. I can call it by no other name. Would you like to see the original? Curiously enough, I have it here. The bishop has left it in my charge. The wolfish light flamed up in Cartwitchet's eyes as I drew forth the case. He laid the Valdez down on a sheet of paper, and I placed the other, still in its case, beside it. In that moment they looked identical, except for the little loop of sham stones, replaced by a plain gold band in the bishop's jewel. Cartwitchet leaned across the table eagerly. The table gave a lurch, the lamp tottered, crashed over, and we were left in semi-darkness. "Don't stir!" Cartwitchet shouted. "The paraffin is all over the place." He seized my sofa blanket and flung it over the table while I stood helpless. "There, that's safe now. Have you candles on the chimney-piece? I've got matches." He looked very white and excited as he lit up. "Might have been an awkward job with all that burning paraffin running about," he said quite pleasantly. "I hope no real harm is done." I was lifting the rug with shaking hands. The two stones lay as I had placed them. No! I nearly dropped it back again. It was the stone in the case that had the loop with the 3 sham sapphires. Cartwitchet picked the other up hastily. "So you say this is rubbish?" he asked, his eyes sparkling wickedly, and an attempt at mortification in his tone. "Utter rubbish," I pronounced, with truth and decision, snapping up the case and pocketing it. Lady Cartwitchet must have known it. "Ah, well, it's disappointing, isn't it? Good-bye. We shall not meet again." I shook hands with him most cordially. "Good-bye, Lord Cartwitchet. So glad to have met you and your mother. It has been a source of the greatest pleasure, I assure you." I have never seen the Cartwitchet since. The bishop drove over next day in rather better spirits. Miss Panton had refused the chaplain. "It doesn't matter, my lord," I said to him heartily. "We've all been under some strange misconception. The stone in your possession is the veritable one. I could swear to that anywhere. The sapphire Lady Cartwitchet wears is only an excellent imitation, and, I have seen it with my own eyes, is the one bearing Boggart's mark, the Greek beta." End of section 18. Recording by Katie Riley. July 2010.
Section 19. of Library of the World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Library of the World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 3, by Julian Hawthorne, Editor. Section 19, Without the Wedding Garment, by Anonymous. On one of Lady George Atall's first Thursdays, her rooms were filling to overflow. Barn Street was blocked with carriages. Lady George stood on the big square landing at the top of the stairs and gave her hand so often that after a time it seemed no longer her own. The people thronged up and up. The current appeared unending, and she felt almost as if the circle must be complete, and the string of guests must be revolving, as in a child's toy the figures that are gummed onto a tape go up to the mill, move in endless succession, up and up and up. Her tongue was tired, too, and so was her smile, but each was kept in active work. "How do you do? How do you do? How do you do? Your son not with you? No? I'm sorry. What lovely flowers! How do you do? How do you do? No, almost cold. How do you do? Yes, stifling. Ah, Mrs. Keith, I scarcely thought you would get away. Dull, was it? What, none of the right people? Didn't suppose for an instant there would be. Let me stand here for one moment. I want so much to know who someone is who came in just before us. A beautiful woman, quite too lovely. Mrs. Venables, probably. Not Mrs. Venables? Fair? Lady Fleet? No. Miss Adair? No. Then I can't tell you till I see her. She's coming up now. There, with the fair hair. No, in front of the Brabazons. Lady George had the mischance to drop her bouquet, and in the momentary confusion a name was lost. The lady who advanced behind the unheard name was fair to whiteness almost. Her hair was of a peculiar shade of yellow like pale sulphur. Her eyes were of the lightest grey. Lady George gave her hand and said, "How do you do?" The Brabazons occupied her with some elaborate explanation about why they had been unable to dine in Barn Street, and in the meantime the lady with a murmured word had passed on. Lady George looked after her. She was bowing to someone. She was bowing again, and now again. Apparently she had many friends in the room. Mr. Brabazon was talking to Mrs. Keith, who, as soon as he had moved away, turned to her hostess. "She is handsome. I hope your flowers were not spoiled. I didn't catch the name." The lady was lost in the smart crowd. "Neither did I," said Lady George blankly, "and I don't know her from Adam. She must be some friend of the girls. Joan or Maud must have sent her a card. My memory's so bad. I can't leave this. If you come across either of my daughters, will you send her to me, Mrs. Keith? Oh, here is my husband. George, George, go into the room and tell me who the striking-looking woman with the yellow hair is. There are dozens of 'em. Which? I'll show you," said Mrs. Keith. She was interested. The two moved away, but like the dove from the ark, they did not return. Lady George, after 10 minutes or so, felt that she had done her duty, and she left the top of the stairs. She forgot the unknown lady, and it was half an hour before she came across one of her daughters. "Maud, I had something to ask you, and I forget what." "Oh, yes. Who is— I can't see her now. Yes, there she is, that woman with the yellow hair standing by the mantelpiece." "In white? I don't know." "But neither do I. I thought you would be able to tell me. Find Joan and send her to me." It was 20 minutes before Lady George's second daughter appeared before her. By that time the lady had moved her place. "I know the one you mean," said Joan, "but I don't know who she is. She has very curious hair, and she is in white." "Yes." "Well, I don't know." Mrs. Keith came up. "Lord George doesn't know," she said. "I can easily find out," said Joan. "She has been talking to Charlie Vincent for the last 10 minutes. I'll ask him." She moved away as she spoke. Young Vincent was leaning against a pillar and laughing heartily. He was the butt for the moment of a chaff of 2 of his friends. Joan heard a few of their remarks. "He didn't mind, don't you know? Awfully pretty woman like that. Neither would you. Said she met him at Nice, and dear old Charlie's never been out of the country in his life." Vincent caught Miss Athol's eye. "You are going to let me take you down to supper?" he said to her. "I will see later on," said Joan. "Just now I want you to tell me something. What is the name of the lady you were talking to a few minutes ago?" He began to laugh. "At what?" said Joan. Well, the whole thing. Those two chaps have been chaffing me like anything as it is. You mean the handsome woman with the fair hair? Yes. I was standing near her when she turned round and put out her hand. She said, Mr. Vincent, isn't it? And I said yes. And then she said she hadn't seen me for ever so long, and I didn't like to pretend that I did not know her. So I said that it was rather a long time, and then we talked for a bit. And you don't know who she is? Never saw her before in my life. Who is she? Where did she think she had met you? Said Joan, without answering his question. Well, you see, that didn't come out till quite the end. She said it must be 2 years since the days at Nice, and by that time I was so steeped in deception I had allowed my reminiscences of our former acquaintance to go to such lengths in order to coincide with hers, that I had not the face to tell her that I had never been at Nice in my life. She mistook me for someone else. I knew that after the first half-dozen words. But you see, I had woven such a tangled web that I couldn't get out of it even if I wanted to, and those two chaps say I didn't. Joan laughed. She is very handsome, she said, but I'm not quite sure that she has good style. And you won't come down to supper? Not now. I would ask her if I knew her name, said Vincent. I must get Lady George to tell me when I see her. You won't do that, said Joan, and she left him with a smile that he failed to interpret. Miss Athol went back to her mother. On the way she passed the fair unknown talking to Mr. Brabazon. I watched that, Mrs. Keith was saying. She dropped her fan. Well, Joan, what had Mr. Vincent to tell you? Nothing, said Miss Athol. The mystery remains a mystery. She mistook him for someone else. She bowed to Lady Beckenham, I think. Here is Lady Beckenham. I will ask her. Not to me, said Lady Beckenham. Lady George explained the situation. If I were in your case, I should go to her myself, said Lady Beckenham. I must, I think, said Lady George, and she sought her unknown guest. You will pardon me, she said, but I did not hear your name, and my memory is bad. I do not recall your face. I am Mrs. Derbyshire, said the lady. I was so sorry not to return your call on Monday. It was good of you to come and see me so soon. Derbyshire? Call? Lady George looked at her vacantly. The lady caught something of her hostess's expression. Can there be any mistake? She said. I don't know you, of course, because I did not see you when you called. You heard from my dear friends, the Van Lindens of New York, and you came to see me and asked me to your party? Lady George looked more vacant. You are Mrs. Sefton, surely, said the lady. There is some mistake, said Lady George. I am Lady George Athol. Mrs. Derbyshire had started to her feet. How can I sufficiently apologize? She said. I am a stranger in London, and I only arrived from New York last week. I had an introduction to Mrs. Sefton. I do not know her personally, so I did not discover my mistake. I came in a hansom, and I suppose the driver mistook my direction. Lady George smiled graciously. The mistake is easily explained if Mrs. Sefton lives in Barn Square. That is it, I think, said Mrs. Derbyshire, and this is Barn Street. I am so distressed this should have happened, said Mrs. Derbyshire. Not at all, said Lady George. You found some friends here, I hope, and it has given us the pleasure of your company. The lady, with reiterated apologies, bowed and took her departure. A man who passed her on the stairs looked at her fixedly, and hurried up to his hostess. Will you tell me that lady's name? He said. 5 minutes ago I might have asked you, Colonel Weston. She is a Mrs. Derbyshire, I believe. Her cabman mistook Barn Street for Barn Square. You know nothing about her? Nothing. Then excuse me. Colonel Weston hurried down to the hall. Mrs. Derbyshire was coming from the cloakroom. Mademoiselle Lestock will permit me to see her to her hotel? The lady started, then smiled and bowed. Monsieur est bien aimable, she said. He followed her to the hansom and got in. He spoke up through the trap. Drive slowly to the end of the street, and I will direct you. He turned then to his companion. We meet again, mademoiselle. Oui, monsieur. Mademoiselle has, perhaps, few friends in London. Not many, monsieur. Mademoiselle, however, starts well under such a wing as that of Lady George Athol. Without doubt, monsieur. A more softly feathered wing than that of the law, mademoiselle. You should know. Monsieur is facetious. I should like to see what you have in your pocket, mademoiselle. My handkerchief, monsieur. What else? A meagre purse. What else? That is all. That figure clad in dark blue is a policeman. What else, mademoiselle? Only this, said Mrs. Derbyshire. She handed him a small diamond brooch as she spoke. Only that? That is all, monsieur. I have had no luck." "You are sure that is all? A word to my friend in blue—" "Save yourself the trouble, monsieur, that is all." "Good night, mademoiselle. Good night for the old sake's sake." "Good night," said Mrs. Darbyshire. Colonel Weston called another cab and drove back to Barn Street. "A chance likeness, perhaps, to some one I met in Paris," he said to Lady George. "One is easily mistaken. I have just picked this up," he added, putting the brooch into her hand. "Do you know whose it is?" "Some one is sure to claim it," said Lady George. A few days later it chanced that Lady George Atholl and Mrs. Sefton met. "I suppose you heard from your friend Mrs. Darbyshire of her coming to my crush in mistake of yours?" "Mrs. Darbyshire," said Mrs. Sefton, "but she came to me the night before last for you. Her cabman mistook—" Lady George opened her eyes. "When did that happen?" "On Wednesday. I have good reason to remember the day, for I lost an emerald bracelet." End of section 19.
Section 20 of Library of the World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by summerdaze. Library of the World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 3, by Julian Hawthorne, Editor. Section 20. Mr. Twistleton's Typewriter, by Anonymous. Mr. Twistleton's Typewriter. Several strange things have happened to me in my life that my friends could never account for. They could never understand how I got an introduction to Twistleton, Q.C., nor why that learned gentleman, after allowing me to devil his work for him for 10 years without putting anything in my way, suddenly used every effort and influence he was capable of to put an important and valuable junior practice in my hands. Twistleton, Q.C., was a hard, selfish man. In person, he was like a badly dried moth, whose long, old-fashioned whiskers resembled the remains of wings. It was of him that it was originally said that he was the living representative of a tenant entail after possibility of issue extinct, and there is consequently great surprise when Twistleton married Lucy Travers, who, as you will remember, was the belle of her season. But the Travers were not so well off as they pretended to be, and Twistleton, as we all know, made his 15,000 a year, and had, if anything, an ever-increasing practice in the Chancery Division. Twistleton was undoubtedly a great lawyer, and a man of strong common sense, but he had 2 fads. He was a believer in ghosts, and he wrote everything in his chambers upon a Remington typewriter. Twistleton and his wife were staying one June in Norfolk at Lady Barndore's. Twistleton was due in town to argue the great patent case concerning sewing machines of Buncombe and Another versus Badger in the Court of Appeal on Wednesday morning. I expected him back in chambers on the Monday evening, understanding that he intended rejoining his wife at the end of the week. For this case would last at least 3 days, and Twistleton was in several other cases on the list. About 8 o'clock on Monday evening, I had dined early at my club, and was engaged noting up Twistleton's papers, when he came in, with his Gladstone bag and rug, looking, as I thought, tired and out of spirits. When Twistleton was in town by himself, he always slept at his own chambers, as in the old days before he was married, and his breakfast, a chop and 2 eggs, was sent in from the cock. Twistleton, having heard what Foss, his clerk, had to say on the subject of retainers, dismissed him. Then he slammed down the windows, which I had opened to let in what fresh air there was in Old Square, carefully closed the door, let himself into the hard chair in front of his writing-table, and idly leaned over the papers which were before him. At length the outer door was heard to close. Foss had departed, and Twistleton broke silence. "Penrose, my dear fellow, I am uncomfortable." Twistleton, I may here remark, was always on the best of terms with me, and treated me as a friend, for I believe I was useful to him. I had made great way in his affections by solemnly advising him to marry Miss Travers when I saw he was bent on doing so. But since his marriage, I am not sure that this course of conduct of mine had been altogether to my advantage. I looked to him for a further explanation, which I saw was coming. "Penrose, my dear fellow, who do you think is at Lady Barndore's?" I shook my head, being entirely in ignorance. "Charlie Colston," replied Twistleton, trying to carve his whiskers with a paper knife. "Charlie Colston." Poor Charlie Colston. It was well known that he had paid his addresses to pretty Mrs. Twistleton in former days, and report said she had encouraged them. No wonder Twistleton was excited. I knew him to be of an extremely jealous nature. "Now mark me, Penrose," said Twistleton, shaking his forefinger at me as he would at Lord Usher in the appeal court. "What took place yesterday when I was playing tennis? The whole time, sir, he and she were talking and chatting together, and laughing, yes, laughing. Perhaps at my play, for I played abominably, I know it. I could not bear to see them." Twistleton's tennis was never first-rate. He had begun to play too late in life. He was an annoying partner, as he always insisted on leading, taking all the difficult strokes and failing at them. He was a still more objectionable opponent, as he was always taking technical objections on points of practice. Still, however badly one plays, it is not pleasant to be laughed at, even by one's wife. I tried to soothe Twistleton, but he interrupted me. "Now there is another point I desire to urge." Twistleton always spoke as though he was addressing the Court of Appeal. "When I asked my wife to come back today, she point-blank refused. What do you think of that?" "Nothing whatever," I answered. "She had arranged to stay, and you are going down on Saturday again. I think you are making mountains out of molehills." "I hope I am, Penrose, I hope I am," replied Twistleton mournfully. "But you didn't see them. I did." And Twistleton sighed deeply. Then the subject dropped, and we got to work on a small case. Soon Twistleton, with a self-complacent smile on his countenance, was playing an opinion on his typewriter. It was to him, I believe, as though each note he struck produced a deep mellow tone, and not a capital or small Roman. I can remember when Twistleton first had his typewriter. In those days he used to sit at it for hours practicing, hitting first one note, and then the other, at intervals varying between 10 seconds and 2 or 3 minutes, every now and then using the most horrible language, as he put a capital for a small Roman or missed a space. Then his efforts looked as though they were the productions of 6 drunken printers who had each taken an absent comrade's work for the day, and they were always copied before they went to clients. Now the machine went click, 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 evenly and merrily. Twistleton was a perfect master of it. I had seen him work it with his eyes shut. I have no doubt that if he could have stood on his head, and if it had been consonant with the dignity of a Queen's Counsel to do so, he could have played his instrument in that posture. The opinion finished, Twistleton, who was a very methodical man, put a fresh sheet of paper in readiness to commence again, folded and signed what he had written, and bade me good night. His last words to me were, "I hope you are right about Charlie Colston." "I am sure of it," I said. "I wish I were." Tomorrow we were to have a long day at Buncombe versus Badger. When I arrived in the morning, Twistleton was at breakfast. I no longer entered than he set down his egg spoon, and rushing at me with a piece of paper, thrust it into my hands. "Read that!" he cried excitedly. "Read that!" I noticed that Twistleton seemed unwell. There was a wild look in his eyes. His chop was untouched, a reversal of Twistleton's procedure at breakfast, which was more extraordinary to me than his strange appearance. The egg he was eating was, to anyone with a sense of smell, manifestly a bad one, a most portentous fact to me, who remember hearing Twistleton, who never knew any criminal law, seriously tell the boy from the clock that he believed a bill of attainder would lie against him for bringing him a bad egg. What did it all mean? I looked at the paper in my hands. On it were 2 words neatly printed. Charlie Colston. I stared blankly at Twistleton. What did it mean? Twistleton was shaking visibly. "Do you believe in ghosts?" he asked anxiously. "Certainly not," I replied. "Ah," sighed Twistleton, and added sententiously, "there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamed of in your philosophy." This was the only quotation I ever heard him utter that did not come from the law reports. I believe he fancied it was a phrase he had invented in his early youth when he first began to believe in ghosts. "If you don't believe in ghosts, who wrote that message on my typewriter?" Twistleton's manner was very impressive. I felt like a witness committing perjury. "I tell you, I found it this morning when I went to write a letter just before breakfast. Who wrote it?" he shouted. "Who wrote it? I will know." "Perhaps Foss," I suggested. "He has not been here, and can't use the typewriter." I had heard him say so, but did not believe it. Foss was afraid of overworking himself, and so did not choose to learn it. But any fool could use it if he liked to learn. My opinion was that Foss could use it. He was like the monkeys, who, as the Negro said, could talk if they would, but knew if they did, they would be made to work. "How about the laundress?" I suggested. "Ah, the laundress," repeated Twistleton thoughtfully. "The laundress." So Mrs. Buttock, the laundress, was sent for when Foss came in, but she denied all knowledge of the typewriter or the writing, making a new suggestion which did not, to our thinking, much advance the solution of the mystery, and that was that the culprit was the cat. "It is a message," said Twistleton mysteriously. "A message." "Nonsense," I said. "Some fellow has strolled in and written the name for fun." "Fun!" cried Twistleton indignantly. "Fun!" And then more quietly, "No, I am sure of it. It is a message." Very little of Buncombe versus Badger could I get into Twistleton's head that day. Plans and specifications he seemed not to understand. The seductive literary style of the affidavit had no charm for him. He could only gaze at the paper in his hand and murmur ever and anon, "A message." I saw it was best to humor him, and at my suggestion the typewriter was locked up that night, and he took the key with him into his bedroom. We had had a rattling good dinner together, and when I left Twistleton he was in much better spirits. "If the ghost comes tonight, he won't be able to get at the typewriter anyhow," I said, laughing. "Hush, I don't know," replied Twistleton solemnly. "It is no jesting subject." I went my way, wondering how a man with Twistleton's practice could believe in ghosts, and who the deuce had written Charlie Colston's name on the typewriter. The next morning I walked down to Twistleton's directly after breakfast. I found him in the wildest imaginable condition. He had taken every precaution, locking up the typewriter, placing the key under his pillow, and yet here was the message, as he called it, printed in clear, faultless style. "Charlie Colston. He is with your wife. Charlie Colston." "I must go. I must go. Oh, Penrose, what shall I do?" he cried in agony as I entered the room. "Go?" I said. "And who is to lead in Buncombe versus Badger?" He was silent, and buried all of his face, except his whiskers, in his hands. Even his hands, large and uncouth as they were, could not contain his whiskers. "Think of Ritson and Claim. What will they say?" I urged, seeing the effect that my words had on him. "They rely on you on this case." The name of this eminent firm seemed to call Twistleton to some extent. "My dear Penrose," he said in a trembling voice, "this is a message, I am sure of it. But I will do my duty. I will stay by my clients." "Twistleton, you speak like a Queen's Counsel and a man of honor," I said, seizing him by the hand, proud to shake it. "If it is a message," I added to humor him, "it will come again tonight. I will tell you what we will do. We will watch the typewriter all night." Twistleton wrung my hand with gratitude at this suggestion of mine, and calmed himself. I made him eat some of his cold chop, and sent for some brandy and water for him instead of the tea, which had already stood in the teapot for more than an hour. Then I endeavored to coach him in Buncombe versus Badger, but with small success. Then we went over to the appeal court, in which I took my seat, for though I was not briefed in the case, I had nothing else to do, and was interested in seeing how Twistleton got on with it. He was very able at picking up a case as he went along, and the Court of Appeal stood greatly in awe of him. I had never seen him as nervous as he was today, not even on his wedding day, and I was quite frightened for him. Lord Usher, M.R., supported by Smug, L.J., and Summerbosh, L.J., formed the court. Twistleton came in late. He had been at a consultation. As he entered, I heard two solicitors' clerks say to each other, "Who is that with the whiskers?" "Twistleton, Q.C. He has the biggest practice at the bar." "He looks like a boiled owl," suggested his companion. "Drinks, I believe," was the reply. This was horrible, for Twistleton was a follower of Prebendary Falutin, the great teetotaler. But certainly Twistleton had a dissipated look this morning. His eyes were red, and the lines under his eyes were very dark and hollow. His cheeks were pale and yellow. Something of this kind, I fancy, the Master of the Rolls remarked to Lord Justice Smug, who nodded assent. Twistleton rose to open the case, which was a very intricate one, and Lord Usher, according to his constant practice, interrupted him with the regularity of a piece of clockwork every 2.5 minutes, and then wondered why he did not understand the case and shook himself impatiently. Much to Lord Usher's astonishment, Twistleton did not deliver any of those stinging retorts by which he was wont to keep the Court of Appeal in order, and frighten their lordships into deciding in his favour. On noticing this, the Lord Usher began to chaff and rally Twistleton in a manner that was the admiration of the junior bar, the two Lords Justices, and not least of all, of the Master of the Rolls himself. At length Twistleton, in expatiating on the merits of Buncombe's sewing machine, alluded to it as a typewriter. Whereupon Lord Usher said, with a humorous leer, that if it had been a question of typewriters, no doubt Mr. Twistleton would have been called as a specialist to give evidence, and would not have been arguing the case before them. At which those in the court who knew of Twistleton's fad tittered, and his lordship's namesakes who stand about the court put their hands before their faces and shook visibly for a moment or two, and then called out, "Hush!" and looked angry. But Twistleton lost his temper over this, and asked his lordship if his lordship meant to hint that the court did not want to hear him, and intimated his intention, if such was the case, of sitting down. And then the whole court was really quite silent for a minute or two, in anticipation of a row, and everyone ceased to fidget, and paid close attention to Lord Usher, to hear him, with his blandest and most urbane of smiles, explaining how it was the great privilege of that court to listen to Mr. Twistleton, and what a high value they set upon that privilege, and how it was quite inconceivable to him, Lord Usher, that he, Mr. Twistleton, could imagine for a moment that this court, or any other court, should wish him to sit down. Whereupon Twistleton murmured that his lordship was very good, meaning thereby that he should like to be with his lordship in a small room where he could give him a bit of his mind. Then the case proceeded quite regularly, until Twistleton handed Lord Usher a lot of papers to explain his case. And Lord Usher, coming to one, said, with a knowing side glance at Smug, L.J., that, from the handwriting, it must be a note of Mr. Twistleton's in another case, as he did not know that anyone of the name of Charles Colston was a party to this case. And what would have happened then, I don't know, only the court rose for lunch. I heard 2 or 3 people say that day that Twistleton, poor fellow, was doing more work than he ought to, that Twistleton was a clever fellow, but he could not afford to burn the candle at both ends. Indeed, Twistleton's strange conduct in Buncombe versus Badger was the general topic of conversation in the robing room. When Twistleton came out of court, I had the greatest difficulty to prevent him from rushing down to Norfolk by the night train. He was sure it was true. He believed in the message. I calmed him down, and we had dinner together at my club. He had to continue his speech in the morning. I tried to coach him in Buncombe versus Badger, but it was of no avail. I do not think he even knew for which side he was appearing. We agreed that we would sit up in watches and so keep our eye on the typewriter all night. There was a sofa in the recess of the window, and Twistleton sent me to bed and placed himself on this. I bade him good night, and took his bed for the first half of the night. About 2 o'clock in the morning, I awoke and went to Twistleton. He was wide awake, reading some papers on the sofa. "Have you seen anything?" I asked. "Nothing whatever," he replied. "Nor heard anything?" "Not a sound." We took the lamp to the typewriter and opened it. There was the sheet of paper as he always left it, untouched. Twistleton locked it up again and took the key. "Put it under your pillow." "I will," he replied. "It's very good of you to sit up like this." "It's nothing at all, I assure you," I answered. "Keep strict watch, won't you?" "I promise you," I said. Twistleton shook me by the hand with emotion, and went out. He looked very ill and wretched, I thought, and was sorry for him. Was it a ghost's message, or what, that was making his life a burden to him? Should I solve the mystery tonight? I waited about an hour and a half. The dawn came peeping through the painted shutters and made the lamp look dim. I was almost dozing. In fact, I had shut my eyes and lost consciousness for perhaps a minute, perhaps more. A sharp clicking sound awoke me. It was the typewriter. There, seated on a chair in front of it, playing nimbly on the queer instrument, was a white, misty figure. It had finished. It closed the cover down and turned the key. It wheeled round to the door, and I saw the face and whiskers I knew so well. It was Twistleton himself. My first impulse was to wake him, but I had heard that it was dangerous to wake persons walking in their sleep. He wanted all the sleep he could get, so I decided to let him alone, walk down to my own chambers, and get some rest myself. When I got out into Old Square, I could not help roaring with laughter. It was too funny. The idea of old Twistleton writing messages to himself on the typewriter and being frightened out of his wits by them. What a story to tell against him! No one would believe it. It was too good to be true. I awoke a little late the next morning, but went straight down to Old Square before breakfast. Alas, I was too late. There was Foss in misery over a hasty scrawl of Twistleton's. He had gone to Barndore by the early train. Foss was to make any excuse he thought fit to Ritson and claim. There was the typewriter shattered into 1,000 pieces, its intricate machinery a shapeless chaos. I shuddered to think what would happen if there was anything between Charlie Crln and Mrs. Twistleton. In town, everyone was asking what had become of Twistleton. The rumor went round the law courts that he was insane. I maintained a discreet silence. Mr. Claim was almost crying. A slow coach, murmuring something about bad news and his learned leader, rose to continue Twistleton's opening. Lord Usher, unrestrained by the presence of Twistleton, made the Court of Appeal a place of fiery torment to that eminent elderly junior, Mr. Slowcoach. Bustle, Q.C. for Badger, was not even called upon to reply. Buncombe and another were dismissed with costs. The early train stopped, as I knew, at every station, 40 in number. I could imagine poor Twistleton's state of mind as he pottered along in a slow train to Barndore. He arrived at the house about breakfast time. I have the story from Grimbleton, who was there. He came into the breakfast room, and his appearance elicited a shout of surprise. "What has become of Buncombe versus Badger?" cried Lord Barndore. "Settled, eh?" "Not that I know of," muttered Twistleton sulkily, and then, looking round fiercely, asked, "Where's my wife?" "Not down yet," replied Lord Barndore. Twistleton looked hastily round, as though in search of someone else, and then tore upstairs to his wife's room. The whole company looked at each other in silence. There was some explanation about bad news, but the Twistletons never went into mourning, and Mrs. Twistleton seemed very merry all that day. It was true that Twistleton was moody and shut himself up a good deal. Grimbleton told me that he never understood the whole business in the least. In fact, in Twistleton's circle, it was a 9 days' wonder. By the by, I almost forgot to mention that Charlie Colston left Barndore to be married in Scotland the day after Twistleton came to town. When Twistleton returned to Old Square, he was a sadder and wiser man. He gave up believing in ghosts and did not buy another typewriter. I told Twistleton that I would not let the matter go any farther, and I mentioned at the time that he might get me the junior brief in Buncombe versus Badger, which went to the House of Lords, where, through Twistleton's clear arguments, Lords Justices Smug and Summerbosh were overruled. That year, mostly through Twistleton's influence, my fee book credited me with £2,000. I have kept my secret well, but since Twistleton succeeded Lord Usher as Master of the Rolls, Lady Twistleton has now called on Mrs. Penrose, and, although my wife assures me that she is rather glad of it, she is always telling me now that she does not think so good a story should be lost to the world as that of Twistleton's Typewriter. End of section 20. Recording by summerdaze.